Jeremiah Finch grabbed Clementine Caldwell by the wrist in front of the entire congregation of Oak Haven's First Baptist Church, and he did it slowly, deliberately, the way a man does something when he wants every witness in the room to remember it. She had not made a sound when he did it. That was the part that would stay with people longest. Not the grab itself, not the words that followed, but the silence of a woman who had been taught so thoroughly that she did not matter, that she could not even produce a cry of protest when a man put his hands on her in a house of worship. "Look at her," Jeremiah said, and his voice carried the easy confidence of someone who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. He turned her wrist slightly, not enough to cause real pain, just enough to display her the way a man displays livestock he has decided he doesn't want after all. "My father sent me to settle a debt. He didn't tell me I'd be expected to take this as payment." The laughter started at the back of the church and moved forward like a slow tide. Clementine Caldwell was 26 years old, large-framed and plain-faced, and possessed of a talent for needlework that should have made her famous in any city that valued beautiful things. She had spent half her life behind a sewing machine producing garments that the very women now laughing at her wore to Sunday service. She knew the exact thread count of the silk in Margaret Holt's collar. She had let out the seams of Dorothy Pruitt's wedding dress twice and had never told a soul. None of that mattered in the moment Jeremiah Finch held her wrist up in the light and made his verdict known to Oak Haven. If you've ever stood in a room full of people who were laughing at you, if you know what it feels like to be the joke that everyone else gets to be in on, then you already understand something about Clementine that no introduction could explain. And if you've never experienced that, then stay close to this story, because it will show you something about what people can survive. Hit that subscribe button before we go any further, and tap the like if this story finds you where you are. Drop your city or your country in the comments below. I want to see how far this has traveled, and I don't want you missing a single chapter of what comes next. The debt her father owed had been accumulating for 11 years. Clementine knew the number by heart, the way some people know hymns, not because she had been told it directly, but because she had listened through thin walls her entire life and assembled the truth from fragments. $340, originally borrowed from Harlan Finch's bank to keep the farm solvent after 2 failed harvests. It had grown through interest into something grotesque, something that bore almost no resemblance to the original figure, something that her father, Walter Caldwell, had managed to avoid confronting for so long that he seemed genuinely surprised each time it came up. Walter Caldwell was not a cruel man. He was something in some ways worse. He was a weak man who had learned to dress his weakness in the language of practicality. When he told Clementine on the morning of what would become the worst day of her life that she was going to accompany him to a meeting with young Jeremiah Finch, he said it the way he said everything, gently, vaguely, with enough softness in his voice that the hard edges of the actual situation were difficult to locate until you were already inside it. "Harlan's boy wants to discuss the matter personally," Walter said. He was at the kitchen table with his coffee, and he did not look at her when he said it. He had not looked at her directly in perhaps 3 years, a habit she had stopped trying to understand. "He's got something in mind. A solution." "What kind of solution?" Clementine asked. "The kind that settles things." He turned the cup in his hands. "Put on the blue dress. The one without the stain." She had wanted to ask more questions. She had a talent for questions. Her mind moved quickly, and she saw angles that others missed, a fact that had never done her much practical good in Oak Haven. But she had also spent 26 years learning the particular futility of asking Walter Caldwell questions he didn't want to answer, so she went upstairs and put on the blue dress and told herself it would be some kind of arrangement about the land, or the harvest schedule, or a payment plan that would finally make sense. The church had seemed strange to her from the moment they arrived. It was a Wednesday, not a Sunday, but the pews were already half filled when Walter led her inside. She noticed the faces before she understood why they were there. Margaret Holt, Dorothy Pruitt, the Alderman brothers, Reverend Cates, standing to one side with his hands folded and his eyes directed carefully at the floor. The presence of so many people for what she had understood to be a private financial meeting should have told her everything she needed to know. It didn't. She had still been arranging the situation into something manageable in her mind when Jeremiah Finch came down the center aisle from the front of the church and stopped in front of her father. Jeremiah was 28, blonde, and possessed of that specific brand of confidence that develops in young men who have grown up watching their fathers command rooms. He was not unintelligent. That was important to understand about him. His cruelty was not the product of a simple mind, but of a calculating one. A mind that had decided early that the world was divided into people who were useful and people who were not, and that no useful purpose was served by being gentle with the latter category. He looked at Walter first. Then he looked at Clementine with the slow, appraising eye of a man who has already made his decision but wants the theater of deliberation. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, I appreciate you coming." "Of course," Walter said. "Jeremiah, we're grateful for the opportunity to—" "I've been thinking about the debt." Jeremiah spoke over him without apparent effort, the way a river speaks over a stone. "My father's getting on in years. He wanted this matter closed. I told him I'd see to it personally." He paused. "You understand what we discussed?" Walter did not answer. Clementine looked at her father's face and saw something she recognized, the particular stillness of a man who is hoping that if he doesn't move, the bad thing won't happen. "The arrangement," Jeremiah said, more specifically now, "was that the debt would be forgiven in exchange for a more permanent connection between your family and mine." He turned his gaze back to Clementine with the directness of someone stating an inventory fact. That was the proposal. The silence in the church lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Clementine spent those 3 seconds understanding that the meeting had never been about a payment plan, that her father had known exactly what it was about, and that the people in the pews had been invited here to witness something specific. "I'm not interested," Jeremiah said, still looking at her. He said it the way a man says he's not interested in a cut of meat he's just examined at the butcher's counter. Decisive, a little bored, not unkind in tone, but devastating in implication. "Jeremiah," Walter said, and there was a quality in his voice, not protest exactly, but a kind of plaintive surprise, as if he had expected a different outcome to this arrangement he himself had made, as if he had genuinely believed his daughter was the kind of offer a man like Jeremiah Finch would accept. "I came here to do you a courtesy," Jeremiah said to Walter, and his voice now took on the warm, reasonable tone of a man explaining something to someone who should already understand it. "I wanted to let you know, with people present, that the debt stands, all of it, and I'll be taking the farm by end of the month if it isn't settled in full." He paused. Then he added, as if it were a small afterthought, something barely worth mentioning, "You should have thought about what you were offering before you made the offer." He looked at Clementine when he said that last part, not with anger, with something more precisely calibrated than anger, with amusement. That was when he took hold of her wrist. Not violently. That was the thing that made it so specific in its cruelty. The deliberateness of it, the lack of violence, the performance of assessment. He lifted her arm slightly, just enough to present her to the assembled witnesses, and he said, "Look at her." And the church laughed, and Clementine stood inside that laughter and felt something inside herself that she could not immediately name. She thought in those first seconds that it was humiliation. She had felt humiliation before and recognized its texture, the heat in the face, the desire to become physically smaller, the impulse to apologize for existing. She waited for those sensations to arrive. They didn't come. What came instead was something colder and more precise. It was a kind of clarity, the sudden crystalline understanding that she had been living inside a story that other people had written for her. A story in which she was the burden, the problem, the thing that nobody wanted, and that this moment, this terrible public moment, was the story reaching its most honest expression. She was not going to cry. She was surprised to realize that. She had expected to cry. Jeremiah was still talking. He had released her wrist and was addressing the room now, performing for his audience with the ease of a man who had done this before. He was saying something about the Caldwell debt and community standards and the importance of men keeping their financial commitments. And the people in the pews were nodding in the way people nod when someone powerful is performing reasonableness at them. Walter had moved 2 steps to his left, away from his daughter. She noticed that. She filed it away in the part of her mind that collected things she would think about later, in the private hours when she was allowed to be honest with herself about what her life actually contained. "You should probably find somewhere to go," Jeremiah said to her, addressing her directly now with a kind of generous condescension, the voice of a man being more helpful than the situation required. "A woman in your circumstances has options. There are domestic positions in Denver, churches that take in, well," he smiled. "People find their way." The laughter was quieter this time, more uncomfortable, some of it. A few people in the pews had faces that suggested they weren't entirely comfortable with how far this had gone, but none of them said anything. In Clementine's experience, people who were not entirely comfortable with how far things had gone almost never said anything. She was looking at her hands. She did not know why she was looking at her hands. They were large hands, a seamstress's hands, strong and calloused and precise, hands that had produced thousands of tiny perfect stitches, while the women who wore the results of those stitches stood in her fitting room and talked about her as if she weren't present. She was thinking about what Jeremiah had said, people find their way, and she was thinking about her father's 2 careful steps to the left, and she was thinking about the farm that would be gone by end of the month, and she was thinking about where exactly she was supposed to go. The church doors opened. She heard them before she turned, a heavy, deliberate sound. 2 solid slabs of wood pulled back with a force that was neither violent nor performative, but simply the force of someone who opened doors by pulling them open, without consideration for the impression it made. The light from outside cut through the dim interior, and for a moment she couldn't see the figure in the doorway at all, only the shape of him. Large, broader than the frame would have suggested a man should be, standing with a stillness that was different from Walter's stillness. Not the stillness of a man hoping the bad thing wouldn't happen, but the stillness of a man who had already considered whether the bad thing was something he needed to respond to. The laughter in the church stopped. Not gradually. Immediately. The way sound stops when something unexpected walks into a room. Gideon Hayes stood in the doorway of Oak Haven's First Baptist Church and took in the scene with eyes that had spent 20 years reading landscapes for the information that kept men alive. He was 40, or close to it, with a face that had been worked on by weather and circumstance, a long scar running from his left temple to his jaw from an encounter with a grizzly that had left him as the only one walking away. He was dressed in frontier clothes, practical, worn, not rough, and he carried no visible weapon, which in its own way was more unsettling to the people in that church than if he had. He looked at Jeremiah Finch. He looked at Walter Caldwell. He looked at Clementine. She had never seen Gideon Hayes before in her life. Most people in Oak Haven hadn't, except as a rumor. The hermit mountain man up at Whisper Ridge, the one who came into town twice a year for supplies, and said nothing to anyone and left the same way he arrived. He was the kind of story people told their children when they wanted them to understand that the wilderness beyond the town's edge was not a friendly place. He walked down the center aisle of the church without hurrying and without the self-consciousness that most men carried when they were being watched. He stopped in front of Jeremiah Finch, close enough that Jeremiah took a half step backward before he caught himself. "I heard something about a debt," Gideon said. His voice was not loud. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to be. Jeremiah recovered quickly. You had to give him that. He was not someone who lost his composure easily. "Mr. Hayes, this is a private matter." "I heard that too," Gideon said. He glanced briefly at Clementine, and she had the strange sensation of being seen, not assessed, not evaluated, but seen. The way you are seen by someone who is trying to determine what the situation actually is, rather than what it looks like. "What's the number?" "I beg your pardon?" "The debt. What is it?" Jeremiah's jaw shifted slightly. The calculation in his eyes was visible if you knew where to look. He named the figure. Gideon reached into his coat without ceremony and produced a pouch that hit the pew beside Jeremiah with a sound that did not require interpretation. It was the sound of significant weight in a small space. "Count it," Gideon said. The silence in the church had become something physical, something that the people in the pews seemed to be breathing carefully around. Jeremiah did not move to pick up the pouch. "Mr. Hayes, I don't think you understand what's being arranged here." "I understand what I saw when I walked in," Gideon said. He was not raising his voice. He hadn't raised his voice once. "Count the money." Jeremiah picked up the pouch. He opened it with the careful movements of a man performing calm he does not entirely feel. He counted. The church was so quiet that the sound of coins was audible in the back pews. When Jeremiah finished counting, he looked up at Gideon with the expression of someone who has just lost a game he didn't know he was playing. "It's all there," he said. "Then the debt's settled," Gideon said. He turned to Clementine and did something she had not expected. He looked at her directly, with a frankness that was not unkind, and said simply, "You don't have to stay here if you don't want to." Clementine Caldwell stood in the silence of the church, where she had been publicly weighed and found wanting by a man who would never in his life have produced 1/10 of the beauty she produced with a needle and thread. She looked at her father, who was still 2 steps to the left, who would not meet her eyes. She looked at the women in the pews who wore her work to worship on Sundays. She looked at Gideon Hayes. "Where would I go?" she said. It was a genuine question. She was not being rhetorical. "Whisper Ridge," he said. "I've got land that needs tending and no one to tend it." He paused. "It's not charity. It's a proposition. You'd have your own roof and fair wages and nobody to tell you what you're worth based on what they see." She thought about the farm that would be gone by end of the month, regardless of anything that happened in this room today. She thought about domestic positions in Denver. She thought about what Jeremiah Finch had said, "People find their way," and how perfectly it had encapsulated the specific kind of dismissal that had followed her entire life. The cheerful certainty of people who had somewhere to be, that you would figure out your own somewhere, eventually, alone. She picked up her coat from the pew where she'd set it. Jeremiah said, "Miss Caldwell," and his voice had shifted register, an urgency in it now that had not been there during the performance, the first honest thing she had heard from him all morning. "Mr. Finch," she said, and she was surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "You've said what you came to say." She walked up the center aisle of the church and through the doors that Gideon Hayes had opened, and behind her she heard Jeremiah's voice, different now, carrying something that was not quite anger and not quite wounded pride, but something in between, saying something to Gideon about what happened to men who interfered in other people's business. And Gideon's voice, very quiet, coming from just behind her. "You can say that to my face, or not at all." The doors swung shut behind them, and Clementine Caldwell stood for the first time in her life outside a room she had just chosen to leave, in the morning light of Oak Haven, Colorado Territory, 1878, with a man she had never met and nowhere yet to belong. She was not happy, she was not certain, she was not even particularly hopeful, but she was, for reasons she could not have fully articulated in that moment, no longer afraid. That was not nothing. The wagon Gideon Hayes drove was not comfortable. Clementine discovered this within the first 10 minutes of sitting in it, when the left rear wheel found a rut in the road that sent her shoulder hard into the wooden sideboards. She caught herself with one hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. It was a wagon, not a parlor, and the road north out of Oak Haven was what it was. Gideon had not spoken since they left the church. He sat with the reins loose in his hands and his eyes on the road ahead, and the particular quality of stillness about him that she was beginning to understand was not coldness, but simply the way he occupied space, without excess, without performance. He did not seem to feel the silence as an absence of something. He seemed to feel it as the natural state of things. Clementine, for her part, was using the silence to take an accounting of her situation, which was something she did when she was frightened and did not want anyone to know it. She did it the way she did everything practical, systematically, without sentiment, starting with the facts and working outward. The facts were these. She had left the only home she had ever known in the company of a man she did not know, based on an offer that was reasonable on its face and terrifying in every other respect. She had no money of her own. She had the blue dress, her coat, and the small sewing kit she kept in her coat pocket out of habit, the one with the 3 needles and the 4 colors of thread, and the pair of small scissors she'd carried since she was 12 years old. She had no idea what Whisper Ridge looked like or what tending land actually meant in practice, or whether the proposition Gideon Hayes had made in that church was the kind of proposition a person could trust. She had, in other words, nothing except the decision she had already made, and the particular stubbornness that came from having spent 26 years being told she was not enough of anything. "How far?" she finally said. Gideon glanced at the sky. 4 hours. Maybe 5 if the North Pass is soft. Soft. Muddy, he said, from the snowmelt. She nodded. 4 hours or 5. She looked at the road ahead and then at the backs of the 2 horses pulling the wagon, a matched pair of grays that moved with the unhurried efficiency of animals that had made this trip before. "What does the land need tending to mean?" she said, specifically. He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone avoiding the question, but the silence of someone deciding how much specificity to offer. "The house needs cleaning. I'm not much for that. There's a kitchen garden that's been let go. Chickens, 12 of them, that don't get collected from regularly enough. General management of the domestic side of things. He paused. I'm gone from the property 3-4 days at a time, trapping and ranging. Things fall behind. You said wages. Fair ones. I'd need to know the number, she said, to know if they're fair. He named a figure. It was higher than she had expected, not generous by the standards of anyone with real options, but higher than what she had been paid for her sewing work, which had always been settled in the vague economy of goodwill and partial payment and promises about next season. All right, she said. He nodded once, like a man accepting a bid at auction, and that was the end of the negotiation. The road climbed north, and the flatness of the valley gave way to terrain that had opinions about itself. Hills that pushed back against the wagon's progress, stretches of pine that narrowed the sky to a pale strip overhead. And then, around midday, the first real look at what the mountains above Oakhaven actually were when you got close enough to stop treating them as background. Clementine had lived within sight of those mountains her entire life. She had never gone into them. Nobody she knew went into them except Gideon Hayes, apparently, twice a year in each direction. The wagon stopped at a wide, shallow creek crossing that the horses navigated with experienced indifference. You've done this trip a lot, she said. Since I was 22, he said. She did the math. 18 years. You've been up here 18 years? Not continuously. He adjusted the reins as the wagon tilted up the far bank. I came up in 71 after. He stopped. Then he said differently, after things changed. She waited to see if he would say what things. He didn't, and she didn't press it. She had her own things she didn't discuss with strangers, and she was beginning to form the understanding that Gideon Hayes would tell her what he wanted to tell her in the sequence he wanted to tell it, and that this was simply how he was, rather than something he was doing to her specifically. They stopped once to eat, briefly, from a pack he produced from behind the seat. Dried meat and hard bread and a canteen of water that he handed to her first without comment. She ate without self-consciousness, which was something she had to actively not be self-conscious about, because she had spent years in Oakhaven navigating the specific social cruelty that surrounded a large woman eating in public. She waited for something from him, a look, a comment, the particular quality of attention that meant someone was watching and cataloging. And nothing came. He ate his own food and looked at the tree line and appeared to be thinking about something unrelated to her entirely. It was, she thought, one of the stranger experiences of her adult life. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. Why did you do it? She folded the paper that had wrapped the bread into a small, neat square, a habit she didn't examine. In the church. You don't know me. You didn't have to spend that money. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, I've been in Oakhaven twice a year for 18 years. Every time I come in, people act like I'm something that crawled out of the hills and might bite them. He said this without self-pity, as a statement of established fact. Last February, I watched Jeremiah Finch tell the hardware man that he should charge me twice the price for nails, because I probably couldn't count anyway. I've seen what that family does when they decide someone is beneath them. He picked up the reins. And I could afford it. That's it? He looked at her then briefly. What would you prefer I say? She thought about it. Nothing, she said. That's honest. I appreciate honest. He made a sound that might have been the leading edge of something, an almost laugh that he pulled back before it fully arrived. Good, he said, because I'm not much for the other kind. The wagon moved on. The North Pass was not soft. The cold had held longer at elevation than Gideon had expected, and they crossed it in early afternoon with the horses breathing hard and Clementine gripping the sideboard with both hands as the track narrowed to something that seemed to her like a theoretical road rather than an actual one. On her left, the mountain rose. On her right, it fell away into a gorge that produced a sound of water that she could not see the source of. She did not close her eyes. She had decided some time ago that she was not going to demonstrate fear to this man. She did not know. Not because she was performing bravery, but because she was genuinely curious whether she was actually afraid or whether the thing she was feeling was something else. It turned out to be something else, something closer to alertness or attention, the feeling of being fully present in a place that required it. They came around a long curve in the track and Whisper Ridge opened below them. She had not known what to expect. She had told herself she was not going to expect anything, which she knew was itself a form of expectation. What she saw was a valley, Not large, perhaps a quarter mile across at its widest, cupped between two shoulders of mountain with a creek running through the low ground and a cluster of structures at the center that were neither as primitive as she'd feared, nor as comfortable as she'd made herself stop hoping for. The main house was log construction, long and low, with a front porch that had been built by someone who understood that porches needed to bear weight. There was a barn, solidly made, newer looking than the house, a chicken coop, a woodshed stacked to its roof with split timber, a kitchen garden bed that was, as he'd said, let go, the remains of last year's growth still standing dry and brown in the early spring cold. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "I've added to it over the years," he said. There was something in his voice that was almost careful, the way a person sounds when they are trying not to invest too much in what someone else thinks of something they've built. "The barn's well made," she said. "I did the framing myself." He pulled the wagon up to the front of the house and set the brake. "The house is older. Previous owner built it poorly. I fixed most of it." He climbed down from the wagon and came around to her side and offered a hand. She took it without fuss. She had learned long ago that refusing offered hands because she worried about what it meant to need them was a kind of pride that cost more than it protected. His grip was firm, and he didn't adjust for her weight, which some people did in a way that made the help feel like an assessment. He simply steadied her and then let go. The inside of the house was cold from 2 days of no fire, and it was not clean. He had not misrepresented that. There were dishes in the basin and dried mud tracked across the main floor, and a layer of dust on the surfaces that told the story of a man who noticed dirt only when it became impossible not to notice it. But the structure of the space was good. The ceiling was high enough. The windows were real glass and not oilskin. There was a proper iron stove in the kitchen corner and a stone fireplace in the main room and a table large enough to work at. "Your room is there," he said, indicating a door at the far end of the main room. "I'm at the other end of the house." She crossed the room and opened the door. It was small but private, with a narrow bed and a wooden chest and a window that looked east toward the creek. Someone, him, presumably, had put clean bedding on the bed, recently, she thought, judging by the absence of dust on the folded top edge of the blanket. She stood in the doorway of the room and thought about the fact that she had, for the first time in her life, a door that was entirely hers to close. "I'll start on the stove," she said. "I'll get the horses settled," he said. And they separated, which was in its own way remarkable. So, two people who had met 4 hours ago, moving through a shared space without negotiation, each taking up a portion of the work without discussion, as if they had already established the thing that took most arrangements years to produce. She had the stove going within the hour and the dishes done by the time the light had moved to late afternoon. She found the coffee on the shelf where it was obvious it would be, because the shelf arrangement told her everything she needed to know about his priorities. Coffee and lamp oil and flint at the front, everything else pushed to the back. She made the coffee and was pouring it when the front door opened and Gideon came in from the barn with the cold still on him. He stopped when he saw the stove going and the clean dishes stacked at the basin's edge. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at the kitchen corner the way a person looks at a thing that is different from what they left. "Coffee's there," she said. "There isn't any milk." "Never is," he said, and came to the table and sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup. She sat across from him with her own cup, and the silence between them was different from the silence in the wagon. Not the silence of two strangers negotiating the terms of proximity, but the silence of two people who have just finished doing something practical together and have not yet decided what comes next. "I need to know the rules," she said. He looked up. "What rules?" "Your rules. For the house? For the property. What you expect, what you don't want, how things work." She held her cup steady. "I'm not asking to be difficult. I'm asking because I don't want to spend 6 months guessing and getting it wrong." He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't have many," he said. "Don't go into the high north pasture without telling me, because that's where I range and I need to know if someone's up there. Don't let the fire go out overnight in cold months. The pipes freeze and it's a week's work to fix. Don't leave the barn door unlatched. The mountain cats will smell the horses." He thought, "That's most of it." "That's sensible," she said. "I'm a sensible person," he said. "I'm beginning to think so." He looked at her again with that direct, flat quality she was starting to recognize as simply the way his face operated. Not guarded, not hostile, but the look of a man who had spent 20 years in terrain that required accurate perception and had stopped softening his gaze to make people more comfortable. "What are your rules?" he said. She had not expected him to ask. She was quiet for a moment, genuinely thinking, because she had never been asked before. "Don't come into my room without knocking," she said. "Don't tell me I can't do something without a reason. And don't—" She stopped, finding the words for a thing she hadn't put into words before. "Don't say you're fine with something you're not actually fine with. I'd rather know the truth when it's small than discover it when it's large." He nodded. "Fair enough." "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They drank their coffee and the stove produced its heat, and outside the valley was moving into the blue-gray of early evening, with the mountains closing the light from the west. It was not comfortable, exactly. It was something more qualified than comfortable and more functional than not. Two people with wounds they hadn't shown each other yet, sitting in a house that smelled of wood smoke and old effort, trying to figure out what they had agreed to. That night, lying in the narrow bed with the new blanket pulled to her chin and the sounds of the mountain around her, wind, water, something moving in the tree line that turned out to be only the wind, she thought about her father. She thought about his 2 careful steps to the left and the way he had not met her eyes. She waited to feel the expected things: grief, anger, the particular ache of a child who has understood something permanent and terrible about a parent. What she felt instead was something closer to exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of a hard day, but the exhaustion of a long performance that had finally ended. She had spent 26 years being the problem in her father's life, carrying the weight of that framing, trying to be small enough and useful enough and quiet enough to justify her existence in his house. The performance was over. Whatever came next, it would not include that particular work. She slept without meaning to, which was something that hadn't happened in longer than she could remember. In the morning, Gideon was already up when she came out. He had the stove going carefully, she noticed, checking the flue the way someone does when they are accustomed to being the only one who matters if they do it wrong. He had made coffee, and there was dried meat on the table, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of someone who is not quite accustomed to another person appearing in their kitchen, but is committed to not showing that. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. She found the biscuit flour in the second cabinet, where the logic of the shelf arrangement suggested it would be, and made biscuits without discussing it, which was perhaps the most domestic act of independent initiative she had ever performed in a kitchen that was not the one she'd grown up in. She was aware of him being aware of her doing this, and she didn't explain or ask permission, and he didn't say anything, and the biscuits cooked and they ate them, and that was the morning. He showed her the property in the afternoon, walking it with the brief efficiency of a man who knows every square foot of a piece of ground and is unsure how much of that knowledge is interesting to someone else. He showed her the kitchen garden bed and what had been planted in previous years and where the seed stock was. He showed her the root cellar below the barn with its preserved stores. He showed her the creek source and how to judge the water level that meant the lower crossing was passable. He told her which of the 12 chickens had moods and which could be trusted. "That one," he said, indicating a large gray hen that was watching them with one eye from the corner of the coop. "We'll take a finger if you let her. She's fast." "I'll remember that," Clementine said. "Has she got a name?" He looked at the hen with the expression of a man who has strong feelings about something he considers slightly ridiculous. "No." "I'm going to call her Margaret," Clementine said. He looked at her. "I knew a woman in Oakhaven," she said. "Similar disposition." Something moved in his face, not quite the laugh, but closer than the almost laugh in the wagon, something that got further along before he brought it back. He turned and walked toward the barn, and she followed, and the gray hen watched them go with the calm confidence of something that had already decided it was winning. The days that followed had a rhythm that Clementine assembled the way she assembled everything, practically, from observation, testing what worked and adjusting what didn't. The kitchen garden needed warming before it could be worked, so she addressed the house first, which took 3 days of sustained effort that she approached with the same focused attention she brought to intricate needlework. The floors, the surfaces, the windows with their accumulated winter grime, the corners where a year's worth of a solitary man's shed, layers of outdoor living had quietly collected. Gideon came in on the second evening of this and stood in the main room and looked at it in the way he looked at things he was recalibrating his understanding of. He said nothing for a moment. I found 2 pairs of boots behind the door that I think you'd given up on, she said, from where she was working on the window frame. I've cleaned them. The left one on the older pair needs resewing at the welt. I can do that if you have wax thread. I've got thread in the barn, he said. He was still looking at the room. Clementine. You didn't have to do all this on the first week. She considered how to answer that. I know, she said. I wanted to understand what the space was. You can't understand a space until it's clean. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That makes sense, and went to wash up for supper. She found the wax thread in the barn the following morning and re-sewed the boot welt with the small scissors from her coat pocket and the needle she'd had since she was 12 years old. And when he picked up the boot that evening and ran his thumb along the new seam, he looked up at her with an expression that was not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude, but something more like reassessment, the look of a man who had formed a theory about what something was and is discovering the theory was insufficient. Where did you learn to do this? He said. Where did I learn to sew leather? Any of it, the sewing, the detail of it. My mother taught me the basics, she said. She died when I was 9. After that I taught myself because it was the only thing that was entirely mine. She said this without particular weight, as a fact rather than an appeal. I was good at it, and people paid me, mostly. Less than they should have, but enough to matter. He held the boot for a moment. The women in Oakhaven wearing your work, he said. It was not quite a question. Most of them, she said. Yes. He set the boot down. He had the look of a man who is deciding whether to say what he is thinking and then deciding to say it. That's a particular kind of cruel, he said, wearing what someone makes and then laughing at them. People do it, she said. They separate the thing from the person who made it. It's easier that way. For them, he said. Yes, she said. For them. He was quiet. She was quiet. The stove made its sounds, and outside the mountain was doing what it did in the evening, which was to become very large and very close in the fading light, pressing down on the valley with the specific intimacy of terrain that had no interest in human arrangements. He said, I was engaged 8 years ago to a woman in Denver. She had not expected this. She waited. She was a good person, he said, and the care in his voice when he said good person told her something about how he thought of people. So it was not a dismissal, but a genuine, quiet honoring. She wanted children. I'd been sick the winter before, something that the doctor in Denver said had... He stopped, picked up the coffee cup, put it down. I can't have children. The illness did something permanent. The doctor explained it, and I understood it, and I told her, and she... He stopped again. She made the right decision for herself. I don't blame her for it. But it costs something, Clementine said. Yes, he said. It costs something. She thought about what to say, and then said the thing that was true. I was offered as a debt settlement to a man who looked at me and decided I wasn't worth the debt. She kept her voice even. We've both been told we're not what someone needed. I think that's a different thing from being not enough. He looked at her directly, with that flat, accurate gaze. What's the difference? Not enough is a statement about you, she said. Not what someone needed is a statement about the match. She picked up the coffee cup that needed refilling. One of those you can do something about. The other one you can't, and spending your life trying is a waste of what you actually are. He did not answer immediately. When he did, it was not to the substance of what she had said, but to something beneath it. You've thought about this for a while. My whole life, she said simply, and went to refill the coffee. Over the next several weeks, the shape of Whisper Ridge revealed itself to Clementine in the way that all genuine things reveal themselves. Not all at once, but in sequence, each layer requiring the previous one before it could be understood. The valley was more complex than it looked. The eastern slope caught early light that made the kitchen garden viable earlier in spring than the elevation suggested. The creek produced trout through April if you knew where to look. The chicken flock had a social structure as intricate and political as anything in Oakhaven, and Margaret the Gray Hen was, in fact, its unelected president. Gideon left on the 4th day for the high country, the trapping range he worked through spring. He was gone 3 days and came back with pelts and a cut on his forearm from something he described briefly as a bad angle on a steep face and did not elaborate on. She cleaned the cut and bound it without making ceremony of it. And he sat still for this with the patience of a man who is accustomed to tending his own injuries and finds being tended to slightly unfamiliar but not unpleasant. It needs to stay covered for 4 days, she said. 3, he said. 4, she said. The cold dries things too fast up here. It'll crack on day 3 and start again. He looked at the binding with the expression of a man evaluating a professional opinion he has not requested. 4, he said. Yes. The kitchen garden went in during the 3rd week of April, when the ground had softened enough to accept seed. Clementine worked it with the methodical patience she brought to all sustained effort, turning the old growth under and preparing the beds in a sequence that accounted for sunlight and drainage and what had grown where before. She had not gardened before in any serious way. Her life in Oakhaven had not included land, but she approached it the way she approached needlework, which was to say she looked at it carefully and thought about what it was trying to do before she touched it. Gideon came by on the 2nd afternoon and watched her for a while without comment, which she had come to understand was his equivalent of engagement rather than dismissal. "You've put the beans in the wrong spot," he said finally. "I've put them where the drainage runs," she said. "They'll drown where you'd put them." He looked at the grade of the bed and then at where she'd planted and then back. He said, which she had also come to understand was his version of conceding a point without the theatrics of an actual concession. "You could have just said I was right," she said. "I'm still considering it," he said. She laughed. It came out of her suddenly, not a polite laugh or a social laugh, but the kind that surprises you because you had stopped expecting to produce it, loud enough to startle Margaret the hen, who retreated to the far end of her domain with great personal dignity. Gideon looked at Clementine when she laughed, not with surprise exactly, but with attention, the specific quality of attention a person gives to something they hadn't anticipated and find themselves wanting to keep looking at. He looked away first, back at the garden bed. "The beans will probably be fine," he said. "I know," she said, still catching the tail end of the laugh. They worked in the garden for another hour, side by side without particular discussion, and the mountain above them moved through its afternoon light, and the creek ran its cold sound through the quiet. And in the chicken coop, Margaret had resumed her presidential duties, and on Whisper Ridge, something was beginning that neither of them had a clear name for yet, which was perhaps the most honest thing that could be said about it. That evening, after supper, Gideon went to the shelf where she had reorganized the books. 3 of them, worn and repaired with pieces of different leather, evidence of a man who read the same things repeatedly, and picked up the middle one and held it without opening it. "Have you read much?" he said. "Not as much as I'd like," she said. "My father didn't see the point in buying books." He set the book on the table, in the space between them, without pushing it toward her and without pulling it back. "The Cooper is best," he said. "The other 2 are decent." She looked at the book. She looked at the space between them on the table. "Thank you," she said. "It's just a book," he said. "I know what it is," she said quietly. He went to bed, and she sat at the table for a while with the lamp and the book, and she did not read much of it that first night. She mostly sat with it in front of her and thought about the day, and the garden, and the laugh that had surprised her, and the space between 2 people on a table, and what it meant when a person who did not use excess gestures made one anyway. Outside, the mountain held the valley in its dark, and the creek ran and the cold pressed against the windows with the insistence of a thing that would be there tomorrow as well. And Clementine Caldwell sat in a house that was beginning, slowly and imperfectly and without ceremony, to feel like somewhere she had the right to be. She did not know yet what was coming. She did not know about Jeremiah Finch, that he was not the kind of man who accepted a public reversal and returned to his ordinary life. She did not know that 3 weeks after that morning in the church, he had sent 2 men into the mountains to locate Whisper Ridge and return with information about what Hayes had up there worth taking. She did not know that in Oakhaven, the story being told about her departure was not the one she would have recognized, that in the telling it had become something smaller and stranger than what had actually happened, a version in which she was not a woman who had made a choice but an object that had changed hands. She did not know any of that yet. What she knew was the book on the table and the sound of the creek, and the fact that when she had laughed, really laughed, the kind she hadn't produced in years, the man across from her had looked at her like something he hadn't anticipated finding and wasn't sure what to do with. She turned the first page of the book. She read until the lamp oil ran low, and then she went to her room and closed the door that was entirely hers to close, and outside the mountain did what mountains do, which is to say, it kept watch without being asked and held its ground without explanation, the same tomorrow as it had been today, which was in its own way the most reliable thing she had encountered in a very long time. The beans came up on a Thursday. Clementine was not someone who marked occasions. She had grown up in a house where the quiet passing of time was preferable to the attention that marking things required. But she noticed the beans on a Thursday morning in the second week of May, when she went out to check the garden before breakfast. And the small curved hooks of green pushing through the dark soil were so precisely where she had predicted they would be that she stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, just looking. Gideon was at the barn when she went back inside. She heard the rhythm of him working, the particular sequence of sounds that meant he was repairing something rather than preparing for something. And she made breakfast and set his at the table, and when he came in 20 minutes later and sat down, she said without preamble, "The beans are up." He looked at her across the table with the measured expression she had come to read as the one he wore when he was calibrating between saying something and not saying it. "I see," he said. "In the spot I planted them," she said. "I see," he said again, and the second time had a different quality. Not concession, but something that was learning to move in the direction of concession without quite arriving, which was, she had concluded, probably as close as Gideon Hayes got. She drank her coffee and did not press it further, because the satisfaction of being right was already complete, and extracting acknowledgement from him would have been a different, lesser thing. She had noticed this about herself over the past weeks. She was becoming more certain of the distinction between what she needed and what she had been trained to seek, and the two were more different than she had previously understood. 6 weeks at Whisper Ridge had changed her in ways she hadn't catalogued, until she tried to sleep one night and found herself reviewing the person who had walked out of that church in April and comparing her to the person lying in this narrow bed in May. And the comparison was complicated enough that she gave up on sleep and lay there with the mountain doing its dark work outside the window and thought about what exactly had happened. The work had happened, real work. Not the performed usefulness of a daughter trying to justify her presence, but work that had a direct and visible relationship to results. The garden she had planted was growing. The house she had organized stayed organized because her organizational logic was sound. The chickens she tended produced eggs at a rate that Gideon said, in his way, was better than the previous 2 springs, which she took as the substantial compliment it was intended to be. The space had happened. Not loneliness. She had been lonely in Oakhaven, surrounded by people who knew her name and didn't see her. This was solitude, which was different. It had a texture and a quality. It allowed a person to find out what she actually thought about things, when no one was requiring her to think something specific. And Gideon had happened, which was the part of the accounting that she wasn't sure she had the right language for yet. He was not easy. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind because she had a tendency, trained into her by years of needing people to be better than they were, to rewrite difficult people into more manageable versions. Gideon Hayes resisted rewriting. He was stubborn about small things in ways that occasionally required her to apply the patience she had in abundance, but preferred not to spend. He did not explain his thinking unless asked, and when asked, he gave answers that were accurate and efficient and sometimes maddeningly incomplete. There had been an argument in the 3rd week about the wood stack, whether it was organized correctly for the burn sequence, that had lasted 2 days in the sense that neither of them said anything directly hostile, but the air in the house had a quality that required navigation. On the second evening of that silence, she had said, "I'm not wrong about the burn sequence." And he had said, "I've been stacking wood for 18 years. And she had said, "In a barn with a different flue draw. This stove pulls differently." And he had been quiet for longer than was comfortable. And then he had said, "Show me what you mean." Not with the graciousness of a man who has conceded a point, but with the genuine curiosity of a man who wants to understand something. And she had shown him, and by the end of it, the argument was over in the way that good arguments end. Not with a winner and a loser, but with both people understanding something they hadn't before. She had thought about that resolution afterward with a kind of private wonder, because she had not previously had the experience of a disagreement ending in mutual comprehension rather than one person wearing the other one down. What she hadn't told Gideon, what she hadn't told anyone because there had not been anyone to tell, was that the months before Oakhaven, the weeks before the church, she had been operating in a state of low-grade despair that she had managed by staying busy and not examining it directly. Not despair in the dramatic sense, Not the kind that produced crisis, but the quiet, domestic kind. The kind that settles into a person who has been told often enough in enough different ways that she is surplus to requirements. It had been living in her like a slow leak in a roof, present and accumulating and not addressed because addressing it would require acknowledging that the house was damaged. Whisper Ridge was patching the roof. That was the most honest way she could put it. She wasn't healed. She was not transformed. She was a practical woman with a history and a sewing kit and an accurate understanding of how far 6 weeks of better circumstances could take a person. But she was incrementally becoming less afraid of her own future, which was something she had not been able to say in longer than she could remember. What she didn't know, what she was not equipped to know from inside the daily work of the ranch, was that her future was already moving toward her from the south, wearing Jeremiah Finch's face. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of May, and she almost missed it. She had gone to the lower crossing to check the creek level. The snowmelt was running late that year, and the crossing had been borderline passable for a week, and she saw the tracks on the south bank. 2 horses, shod, which meant town horses rather than mountain stock. The tracks came from the south trail and stopped at the creek's edge, and then turned back, as if whoever had made them had looked across at the ranch and thought about crossing and then decided against it. She crouched by the tracks and looked at them with the attention she brought to things that required interpretation. They were recent, a day old, maybe 2. And the stopping and turning quality was deliberate, the tight circle of a horse whose rider has made a decision. She went back to the house and waited for Gideon to come in from the north pasture where he'd been checking fence line. There were tracks, she said when he came in. South bank of the lower crossing. 2 horses, shod, day old maybe. He sat down on what he was carrying and looked at her. Prints deep or shallow? Medium. Not rushing. They stopped and looked. He was quiet. She watched his face go through something. Not fear, nothing as simple as that, but the process of a man who has spent 20 years in terrain that required accurate threat assessment running numbers on a new variable. Could be a trapper, she said, or a rancher looking for strays. Could be, he said. He didn't say what else it could be, and she didn't ask. And that itself was a kind of communication. The acknowledgement, by 2 people who had chosen not to be alarmist. That alarm was a reasonable response that they were choosing not to perform. He went out that evening and was gone for 2 hours, and when he came back he said, "I checked the south ridge, nothing current up there. Whatever it was, it moved on." He hung up his coat. "I'll check the trail markers in the morning." "All right," she said, but she thought about the tracks that night, and she thought about Jeremiah Finch, and she thought about the quality of a man who had stood in a church and performed the public humiliation of a woman and then watched that performance interrupted in front of witnesses. She had grown up around Walter Caldwell, who was a weak man but a predictable one. Jeremiah Finch was a different kind, the kind who kept accounts. She said nothing about this to Gideon. She had no evidence, only pattern recognition, and she was aware that she might be finding shapes in the dark that weren't there. But she added it to the accounting she kept in her head, the one that tracked all the things that required watching, and she went on with the work of the ranch because the work of the ranch did not pause for fear. The week that followed was ordinary in the way that the best weeks are ordinary, full of small problems and small solutions and the accumulated texture of days that are purposeful without being dramatic. The garden grew. Gideon went up to the trapping range and came back with good pelts and a story about a storm on the upper ridge that had taken out a section of the south lean-to on his line cabin, which he described in the clipped, declarative way he described physical facts. No drama, just the thing as it was. She suggested a repair method for the lean-to that he considered for a day before incorporating into his plan, which was as close to immediate adoption as she had come to expect from him. One evening he came in from outside and sat down at the table and looked at his hands for a moment before he said, "My sister is in Denver. I haven't written her in 8 months." She looked up from the jacket she was mending, one of his, the left elbow worn through. She waited. "I'm not good at letters," he said. "Never have been." "What do you want to say to her?" "That things are different now," he said. He looked up. "Than when I last wrote." "That things have changed." She thought about this. "Then say that," she said. "You don't need to make it long. She's your sister. She'll understand that different is different." He nodded. He went to the shelf and got paper and the ink, and he sat at the other end of the table and wrote, and she mended the jacket, and the stove did its work, and the lamp held them both in its circle of light. And the letter that eventually got written was short. She didn't read it, she wasn't offered it, and wouldn't have asked. But she heard the pen moving and then stopping and then moving again, which told her he was revising, which told her he was trying to say something true. When he was done, he set the pen down and folded the letter without sealing it, which meant he was going to read it again in the morning. She had noticed that about him. He did not commit to things immediately. He held them, examined them, confirmed them in the next light before he sent them out into the world. It was the opposite of reckless, and the opposite of cowardice. It was something she didn't have a clean word for. "I'll take it to town when I go for supplies next week," she said. He looked at her. "You're going to town?" "The thread stock is low," she said, "and I need salt in a quantity the root cellar can't absorb any longer." She said it as a settled plan rather than a request, which it was. "Is there something you need?" He started to say something and then reconsidered. "I'll come with you," he said. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the folded letter and not at her, but there was a quality to how he was not looking at her that told her the decision to go to town together was not about errands. She thought about the tracks at the lower crossing. She thought about his 18 years of accurate threat assessment. "All right," she said, "Thursday." Thursday came and they went to town, or they started to go to town, and what happened on the road south altered the shape of everything that followed. They were an hour out from Whisper Ridge when Gideon pulled the wagon off the main track without explanation, driving into a shallow cut between two rises that hid the wagon from the road. He did it without apparent urgency, with the same calm he brought to everything, but the specific economy of the movement told her it was not random. "Stay here," he said. "Why?" He pointed south along the road. She looked and at first saw nothing, and then she saw the two riders, still distant, moving north at a pace that was faster than a casual rider on a supply run, coming from the direction of Oakhaven. "Do you know them?" she said. "The one on the left is Cutter Mace. He works for the Finch family." He said this without any particular inflection. "Has for years." Her chest tightened, not in the way it had in the church, not the hot, immediate thing of public humiliation, but in the quieter and more serious way of someone who has been keeping an account and has just had a line item confirmed. "The tracks at the crossing," she said. "Probably," he said. They sat in the cut while the two riders passed on the main road 30 yards away, close enough that she could see the faces, but not close enough to be seen easily in the shadow of the cut. Cutter Mace was 40 or so, thick-necked and unremarkable, riding with the comfortable posture of a man doing a job he didn't find interesting. The man with him she didn't recognize, younger, with something careful in the way he sat his horse, someone who was paying attention to the terrain in a way that the terrain didn't warrant if you were just passing through. "That second one is reading the road," she said quietly. "Yes," Gideon said. They waited until the riders were north and out of sight, and then sat for a while longer, the horses standing patient and quiet in the cut, while the road told them nothing further. Then Gideon clicked his tongue and the horses moved and they turned south again, and neither of them spoke for a few minutes. "Jeremiah Finch is coming," she said. It wasn't a question. "Not yet," Gideon said, "but he sent people to look first. That's how he does things." He kept his eyes on the road. He planned out what he was going to do in that church ahead of time. He does things in sequence. Look, then plan, then act. She absorbed this. "How much time do we have?" "He'll want a full report. Then he'll plan. Then he'll come," he thought. 3 weeks. Maybe 4. That's not much." "No," he said. "It's not." They went to town and got the supplies and the thread and the salt and mailed the letter to his sister, and they did it without incident, moving through Oakhaven with the contained efficiency of people who have a purpose and no interest in additional complications. Several people stared at Clementine. Margaret Holt was coming out of the dry goods store as they went in and stopped on the threshold and looked at her with an expression that was trying to be unreadable and wasn't entirely succeeding, something between surprise and a feeling she couldn't name, something that Clementine recognized as the specific discomfort a person feels when someone they expected to disappear has not disappeared. "Clementine," Margaret said. "Margaret," Clementine said, and walked past her into the store. On the road home, the wagon climbing north again into the mountains, Gideon said, "What do you want to do about Finch?" She had been thinking about it for the past 3 hours, and she had an answer. "I want to be ready," she said. "I don't want to run, and I don't want to wait without preparation. I want to know what he can legally do and what he can't, and I want us to know the property well enough that when he comes, we're not surprised by the approach." He looked at her sidelong, the way he did when she said something he was adjusting his picture of her to include. "That's a soldier's thinking," he said. "It's a seamstress's thinking," she said. "You measure twice." He almost smiled. She was becoming better at identifying the almost smiles. They lived in the corners of his mouth for less than a second before he brought them back, and they were more honest than the full expressions most people offered because they were involuntary. "I can tell you what he can legally do," Gideon said. "Not much, if we're on the property and armed and haven't given him cause. Trespass laws apply. The deed to Whisper Ridge is registered in Bent County. I filed it in '68 and I have the paper." He paused. "But Finch has money, and money has a way of making legal things complicated." "Then we document everything," she said. "Every approach, every rider, every contact, dates and descriptions, in writing." He was quiet for a moment. "You can write?" "Of course I can write." "I meant, well enough to be useful as record." "I can write in a way that a court would read without apology," she said, which was true. She had educated herself in the years after her mother died with the same methodical stubbornness she brought to everything, and her handwriting was the clearest, most functional thing about her external self. "All right," he said, "then we document." She started the record that evening, a plain-covered ledger she found in the supply order from the dry goods store, the kind used for household accounts. She wrote the date of the tracks at the lower crossing, the date of the riders on the south road, Gideon's identification of Cutter Mace, the description of the second rider. She wrote it in the neutral, observational language of someone keeping a record rather than making an argument, because she understood that the record's value was in its factual quality, not its emotional content. Gideon watched her write it from across the table. He didn't comment, but when she was done, he reached across and turned the ledger to read it carefully, and then turned it back. "Good," he said. "What happens if he doesn't come through legal channels?" she said. "What if he just sends men?" "That's what I'm thinking about," he said. He had his coffee and was looking at the table surface with the specific focused absence that meant his mind was working on something. "The property has 3 approach routes. The South Trail, which we know. The East Ridge Track, which requires a man to know the country or a guide who does. And the North Face, which is technically possible but takes a specific set of conditions because of the slide zone above the creek." He looked up. "He'll come south. He doesn't know the East Track, and the North Face is not something you'd send men through in June unless you knew what you were dealing with." "So we watch the South," she said. "We watch the South," he confirmed. The watching became part of the daily structure of Whisper Ridge, woven into the routine with the same practical acceptance with which they had absorbed everything else. Every morning, Gideon checked the South Trail markers when he went out. Every evening, Clementine added a line to the ledger, either no activity or whatever detail warranted recording. She developed a shorthand for the entries that was efficient without sacrificing completeness, the same cognitive economy she used for marking alterations on a garment. During those weeks of watchful waiting, something else was happening at Whisper Ridge, something that neither of them had planned or negotiated, and that consequently had no framework around it and no name. It began with the evenings, which had always been the time in the house when the daily work was done and the space contracted into itself, and they were simply 2 people in the same room. In April, that contraction had required adjustment. By May, it had been natural. By early June, it had become something neither of them seemed to want to interrupt. He had started telling her things. Not confessions, not the dramatic unburdening that she might have expected from someone who had lived alone for 18 years, but small, specific things. Details about the mountain that had history attached to them. The time the elk herd had come down into the valley during a hard winter in '74, and he'd sat on the porch and counted them in the moonlight. The winter he'd lost 3 traps to a wolverine with a personal vendetta and had spent 3 weeks identifying the animal's logic before he understood how it thought. The summer he'd built the barn alone, which had taken 4 months and left him with a back problem in the right side that still spoke up in cold weather. She reciprocated, which surprised her. She was not by habit a person who told stories about herself because she had grown up in a house where her stories were not particularly wanted. But the quality of his listening was different. He listened the way he looked at terrain, with full, accurate attention and no interpretation overlaid on top of what was actually being said. She told him about the first dress she had ever made from scratch. She was 11, it was from flour sacking she had dyed with berry juice, and it was technically terrible, and she had worn it for 6 months anyway because it was hers. She told him about a woman in Oakhaven, a widow named Agnes Bryce, who had been the one person in town who had spoken to Clementine as a full person, and who had died of a fever 2 winters ago, and whose absence was the specific shape of a particular loneliness that she hadn't been able to discuss with anyone because there had been no one to discuss it with. "She sounds like she was worth knowing," Gideon said. "She was the best person I've ever met," Clementine said simply. "She told me once that most people were afraid of taking up their full space in the world and that I should stop being afraid of mine." She paused. "I've been working on that." He looked at her across the table and said carefully, "You've made progress." "More since April than in the previous 10 years, she said. And then, because she was working on taking up her full space, "That's partly this place, and partly the people in it." He looked at his coffee cup. He was quiet for long enough that she thought that was the end of it, and then he said, "I didn't expect you to be what you are." "What did you expect?" He thought about it with his usual honesty. "Someone who needed saving," he said. "That's what it looked like from the door of the church. A woman who needed someone to intervene. And you don't need saving," he said. "You needed a fair situation. That's different." He looked up. "I've been trying to figure out where I actually fit in the picture." She thought about how to answer that and then said the true thing. "Not as a rescuer," she said, "if that's what you're worried about." She held his gaze. "As a person I'm trying to figure out alongside." He absorbed that. He did not look away, which was itself a kind of answer from a man who generally processed things by looking elsewhere. "That's harder," he said. "I know," she said. "Most things worth doing are." The storm came on a Friday in the 3rd week of June without the warning that most storms provided. The sky in the mountains had been building for 2 days, she had noticed, with the attention she now brought to the valley's patterns, a quality in the air that was different from the usual afternoon buildup. But the speed and force of the actual arrival was beyond what the building had suggested. It came in the late afternoon when Gideon was in the north pasture, checking the fence line he'd repaired the week before, and Clementine was in the barn replacing a broken board in Margaret's domain, which Margaret was supervising with the focused objection she brought to all human activity near her space. The wind hit first, not the wind of a normal storm, but the sideways, ground-level wind that preceded a serious system, the kind that found every gap in a structure and made itself known through them. Then the sound changed overhead, the sky producing a low-pressured note that she had learned in 6 weeks at elevation was not a sound you heard in the lowlands, and was the mountain's specific warning about what was above the cloud layer. She left the barn and looked north and saw the wall of weather coming down the upper valley, and knew from its color and speed that this was not a storm you waited out with the horses in the barn. She went to the barn door and called toward the north pasture, but the wind was already too established for sound to carry in a useful direction. She made the calculation that she needed to make. Gideon knew this mountain and this weather infinitely better than she did, and would respond to a storm correctly without instruction. The horses in the barn were her immediate concern. The chickens were in the coop and would have to manage. The house needed the windows secured. She got the horses into their stalls, which the horses assisted with because they were animals with the good sense to want to be inside, and she latched the barn door with the heavy crossbar Gideon had built specifically for this purpose. Then she ran to the house through the leading edge of the rain that was now arriving in horizontal sheets, got the windows latched, and checked the stovepipe, and was standing in the main room listening to the barn's solidity being tested by the wind, when the front door opened and Gideon came in. He was soaked through. He had come down from the north pasture at a run. She could see it in the condition of him, the mud on his legs, the quality of breathing that meant he had pushed hard. He stood in the doorway and took in the house with a look that told her he had been calculating damage on the way down. "Horses?" he said. "Stalled and barred," she said, 20 minutes ago. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, because he wasn't a man who expressed relief dramatically, but the particular adjustment of someone who has been carrying a weight that has just been set down. "Good," he said. "The coop. It'll hold," he said. "I built it to hold." He moved past her into the main room and began pulling off his coat, and she got the towel from the hook by the kitchen and brought it to him without fanfare, which was, she had discovered, the correct way to offer things to Gideon Hayes, without ceremony, as a practical act rather than a significant one. The storm was serious. It lasted 4 hours in its worst phase, and during those 4 hours the valley produced sounds that Clementine had not previously understood that valleys could produce, a sustained, layered noise that had a pressure component, that she felt as much as heard, as if the mountain above them were exhaling something it had been holding all winter. She was not frightened. That surprised her a little. She was alert, which was different. Alert to the sounds the house made, the sounds of the barn, the quality of the storm's voice, tracking all of it the way she tracked the tensions in a complicated garment, feeling for the place where something might give. Gideon sat at the table across from her, and they played cards with a battered deck he produced from a shelf, because there was nothing else practical to do until the storm passed, and the playing of cards seemed to both of them to be the correct response to the situation. He played with the same direct, undecorated honesty he brought to everything. No bluffing, no strategy more complex than what the hand warranted, no performance. She beat him 3 hands to 2, which he accepted with the lack of theater she had come to expect. On the 5th hand, the barn made a sound that was different from the sounds it had been making. Not structural, she thought immediately, not a failure, but something sharper, shorter, from outside the barn rather than within it. An animal sound partly, but not the horses. She and Gideon looked at each other across the table at the same moment. "Mountain cat," he said, and he was already moving. She was behind him before she had consciously decided to be, and when he went for the rifle above the door, she went for the heavy iron bar she had noticed 3 weeks ago, leaning in the corner by the fireplace, the one she had asked him about, and he had said was a fence post tamper, and which she had noted with the part of her mind that tracked such things and had not mentioned again. He looked at the bar in her hand. He did not tell her to stay inside. She was grateful for that. What came next was fast and loud and confusing in the way that real danger is confusing. Not the clear sequence of a story, but the overlapping, simultaneous quality of multiple things happening in the dark at the side of the chicken coop. Not through the door, which was properly latched, but through a section of wall that the storm had stressed and the cat had found. Gideon went in that direction with the rifle. Clementine went around the other side of the coop to cut off the second angle. What she found at the second angle was not a mountain cat. 2 men were standing 15 feet from the coop, in the dark and the rain, and they were looking not at the coop but at the barn. And one of them had a torch, not lit, not yet, but held with the specific preparation of someone who is about to light it. In the half-second that Clementine had to understand what she was looking at, several things resolved simultaneously. The mountain cat had been a distraction or a coincidence, but either way, it had drawn Gideon to the wrong side of the property. These men had not come through the South Trail tonight. They had come on the East Ridge track, which meant someone had told them about the East Ridge track, which meant Jeremiah Finch had done more thorough preparation than Gideon had anticipated. And they had come in a storm, which told her something about the nature of the instruction they were operating under. Not opportunists, but directed men, men who had been told to come when the conditions provided cover. She stood in the dark, and the rain with the iron fence post tamper in her hands, and she thought, with the clarity that occasionally arrived when everything external noise dropped away, about what Agnes Bryce had told her. "Stop being afraid of your space. Take it." The man with the torch turned and saw her. "Who's—" he started. She did not give him the rest of the sentence. She was not a fighter. She had never hit anyone in her life. What she had was 26 years of physical labor. The seamstress's shoulders, the hands that worked leather, the arms that had spent 6 weeks at Whisper Ridge hauling water and stacking wood and turning soil. And she had the iron bar, and she had 3 feet of reach advantage over a man who had expected to find no one standing in that specific piece of dark. She hit the torch out of his hand first, which was the practical priority, and the clang of iron on iron rang across the yard, and the torch went into the mud, and the rain took the potential of it immediately. The man lurched back, and his companion turned from the barn and came toward her, and she was already moving, because standing still was the option that didn't work. What happened next, she would never be able to reconstruct completely into a coherent sequence, and she didn't try. She knew that she was hit, something that took her across the left shoulder and sent her sideways, mud under her boots. the rain making everything slick and unreliable. She knew that the iron bar was still in her hands, that she had kept hold of it through the impact by what was probably stubbornness rather than skill. She knew that she got back upright, which was the decision that mattered most. The second man was larger than the first, and he came at her with the confidence of a person who had assessed the situation and reached a conclusion, and she had two thoughts in the same instant. She was not going to win this by strength, and she did not need to win it by strength. She stepped into him rather than away from him, which was not what he expected, and used his momentum and his size and the iron bar in a way that owed everything to geometry and nothing to fighting, and he went down hard in the mud with the breath knocked out of him. She stood over him breathing in the rain, and she was shaking. Not from fear, she understood, but from the specific physical aftermath of doing something your body has not previously done. The adrenaline with nowhere left to go. The shot from the other side of the coop was Gideon's rifle, and then Gideon's voice, very clear over the storm. "I've got him, stay down." And then, after a few seconds, his footsteps in the mud, coming around the coop, and the sight of him stopping when he saw her and the two men on the ground. He stood in the rain and looked at the scene in front of him. He looked at her. She was still holding the iron bar, and she was muddy from the shoulder that had taken the impact, and she was shaking slightly, which she couldn't do anything about. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The third man is tied to the fence post over by the east gate." "There were only two here," she said. "Three total," he said. "I got to the cat and found him." He looked at the two men in the mud. "Cutter Mace," he said, identifying the larger one. He said it with the flat specificity of someone completing a piece of information they had been holding. Then he looked at her again, and this time his face did the thing it almost never did. It showed something fully, without pulling back, without the managed economy of his usual expression. "You're hurt," he said. "My shoulder," she said. "It's not serious." He crossed the yard in 4 strides and put one hand on her upper arm and looked at the shoulder, and she could feel the careful quality of the attention, the same attention he gave to things he was trying to accurately assess. His hand on her arm was warm in the cold rain. "Come inside," he said. "I'll deal with them." "I'll come inside when they're secured," she said. He looked at her. He did not argue. 10 minutes, he said. "I'll wait," she said. She waited, in the rain, with the iron bar, while Gideon Hayes secured 3 men who had come to Whisper Ridge under instruction from Jeremiah Finch, with a torch and a purpose that had not come to fruition. She was cold, and her shoulder hurt, and she was still shaking slightly, and she could not remember the last time she had been more certain of exactly where she was and who she was in it. The storm began to ease around midnight, the way mountain storms ease. Not gracefully, but in stages, each stage slightly less than the one before, until what remained was just the normal cold and the normal dark, and the sound of the creek running high from the rain. Inside the house, with the stove going and the lamp lit, Gideon tended to her shoulder with the careful, efficient attention he had brought to every practical matter at Whisper Ridge, and she sat still for it as he had sat still for her tending of his arm in March. And neither of them spoke much while he worked. When he was done, he sat across from her at the table, and they looked at each other, and the table was between them. And the 3 secured men were in the barn in the cold, and the ledger was open at the entry she had started before the storm, with enough space below the last line to finish it. She reached for the pen, and he didn't say anything, and she wrote the date and the details in the neutral, factual language that a court would read without apology. 3 men, East Ridge approach, 1 identified as Cutter Mace, known employee of the Finch family, 1 unlit torch recovered from the mud, no fire set, all 3 secured on property awaiting lawful disposition. She dated it, and she put down the pen. "That's a record," she said. "Yes," he said. "Tomorrow we take them to the sheriff in Oak Haven," she said, "with the ledger. Everything we have in sequence, in writing." He nodded slowly. He was looking at her with that full, unguarded expression he had shown her in the rain, the one that had no economy to it, no management, just the thing itself. "Clementine," he said. The woman they laughed at in that church," he said. "She's the same woman who just—" He stopped, and she could see him choosing, the way he always chose, for accuracy over eloquence. "She's the same woman who was in that yard." She looked at him across the table. "I know," she said quietly. "I've always been her. Nobody gave me a situation where I could find out." He held her gaze for a long moment, and then he nodded. Not the small mechanical nod of acknowledgement, but something deeper, the nod of a man who is committing something to a permanent understanding. Outside, the mountains settled into its post-storm quiet, and the creek ran, and inside the house the lamp held its circle of light, and the ledger lay open on the table between them, full of the kind of evidence that Jeremiah Finch had not accounted for when he sent his men into the mountains. Not the evidence of a woman who had been waiting to be saved, but the evidence of a woman who had been paying attention. They put the 3 men on horses at first light. Gideon had kept them in the barn through the night, secured to the center post with rope. He'd checked twice before he came inside. And in the morning, they were cold and stiff and significantly less confident than they had been when they arrived. Cutter Mace had not spoken since Gideon identified him by name in the yard. That naming had done something to him. The specific deflation of a man who realizes his anonymity has been removed. The younger one, the one who had come at Clementine with the torch, had a bruised jaw and a careful quality to how he held his head that told her the mud had not been gentle when he landed. The third man, the one Gideon had taken at the east gate, was perhaps 30, unremarkable in appearance, and had spent the night developing a story that he tried out on Gideon in the early morning while Clementine was making coffee. "We were lost," he said. "Storm came up and we got turned around on the ridge." "With a torch," Gideon said. "We were looking for shelter. In a storm, on a ridge, in the dark, with a torch you didn't light." Gideon looked at him, the way he looked at things he was not going to waste further analysis on. "Stop talking," he said. The man stopped talking. Clementine had the ledger in her coat, and the coat on her back, and the small sewing scissors in her pocket. She had not left the house without them in 30 years, and she was not going to start now. And she climbed into the wagon beside Gideon, and they moved south with the 3 horses on a line behind them. The 3 men sitting those horses with the combined dignity of people who no longer had any. The road south was clear after the storm. The air had the washed quality that followed hard rain at elevation, everything sharp-edged and present in a way that the usual haze of dust and distance didn't allow. The mountains above them were still capped with fresh white from the previous night, and the creek crossings were running high but passable, and the horses moved with the easy purpose of animals that knew this road well and had opinions about its proper pace. She was aware, riding south, of the difference between this journey and the one she had made north in April. Then, she had been accumulating information about what she had agreed to, building a picture from unfamiliar pieces, trying to determine what kind of situation she had entered. Now she knew the road, knew the terrain, knew the feel of the wagon and the rhythm of the horses, and the particular quality of silence that Gideon produced when he was thinking hard about something. She was not the same person making this trip. She was aware of that without making a significant occasion of it. "He'll know they were caught," she said, an hour out from the ranch. "Before we get there." "Probably," Gideon said. "Mace will have had a return time. When they don't arrive, someone will go looking, and what they find on the East Ridge will tell them enough." "Does that change what we do?" "No," he said. "We go to the sheriff. We present the ledger. We let the law do what the law does." He paused. "Whether it does it well or not is a separate question, but we start there." "And if Sheriff Alderman is in Finch's pocket?" It was a legitimate question, and they both knew it. She had grown up in Oakhaven, and she knew Tom Alderman well enough to know he was not a corrupt man in the active sense. He was not someone who took money to do specific bad things. But he was a man who understood the architecture of power in a small town and generally operated within it rather than against it. Harlan Finch's family had built half of Oakhaven's commercial infrastructure. That was not a fact that existed in isolation from how Tom Alderman did his job. "Then we go to the territorial court in Pueblo," Gideon said. "We document every step and we go higher than Alderman." He glanced at her briefly. "I've dealt with Alderman before. He's not bought. He's just," he chose the word with care, "comfortable." "I know how to talk to comfortable men," she said. He looked at her with the expression that had become one of her reference points, the one that said she had just produced something he was adjusting to accommodate. "How?" he said. "You give them something more comfortable than the alternative," she said. "Alderman doesn't want to back Jeremiah Finch on a criminal case that has documentation. That's not comfortable. 3 men on property, unlit torch, 1 identified employee, what? That's a problem he'd rather not own." She settled her hands in her lap. "The comfortable thing is to process it correctly. We just need to make sure he understands that. Gideon was quiet for a moment. You thought about this a lot last night. I didn't sleep much, she said. Neither did I, he said. They came into Oakhaven at mid-morning, and the town received them the way small towns receive unexpected information, with a pause that spread outward from the first person who saw them, moving from person to person along the main street with the efficiency of a system that had been running this particular operation for years. 3 men on a lead line behind the Caldwell girl, the Hayes man. The combination of those 2 pieces of information was enough to stop several conversations in the street and produce a quality of attention that was not quite hostile and not quite welcoming, but was undeniably interested. Clementine sat straight in the wagon and looked at the street without performing anything, without the apology that had been her habitual posture in this town for as long as she could remember. She looked at Margaret Holt on the boardwalk in front of the dress shop with the same level attention she might give any object in the middle distance. She looked at the door of the Finch Bank as they passed it and noted that the shade was pulled on the interior window that faced the street, which meant someone inside had seen them arrive. The shade's down at the bank, she said. I saw, Gideon said. The sheriff's office was at the north end of the main street in a building that had been built to suggest permanence and had mostly succeeded. Tom Alderman was at his desk when they came in, and Clementine had one moment to read his expression before he composed it into the professional neutrality of his office. A flicker of genuine surprise, quickly managed, followed by the careful arrangement of a man who is buying himself time to understand what he is dealing with. Gideon, he said. He looked at Clementine. Miss Caldwell. Sheriff, Gideon said, I see you've brought some company. 3 men came onto my property last night, Gideon said. He said it with the flat, declarative quality of someone reading from a record, which was appropriate because that was exactly what followed. One of them is Cutter Mace, employed by the Finch family. They came in through the East Ridge approach during the storm. One carried an unlit torch. They were subdued and secured overnight. He put his hand out to Clementine without looking at her, and she produced the ledger and he set it on Alderman's desk. Everything is documented. Dates, descriptions, prior incidents. This is the 3rd record of activity that we believe originates from Jeremiah Finch. Alderman looked at the ledger. He looked at the 3 men visible through his window, still on their horses in the street. He looked at Gideon and then at Clementine, and she watched him doing the arithmetic she had predicted he would do. That's a serious allegation, he said. It's a documented one, Clementine said. The ledger goes back to late May. I kept it. You'll find the entries consistent and specific. Dates, times, physical descriptions, identifications where we had them. Alderman opened the ledger. He read with the careful pace of a man taking something seriously who also wants to be seen taking it seriously, which were 2 different things but could share a performance. He turned pages. He stopped at the entry she had written the previous night, the one with the date and the names and the specific factual language of someone who understood what a record needed to contain. He closed the ledger. I'll need to hold these men, he said, and I'll need statements. We'll give them, Gideon said, and I'll need to... Alderman stopped. He picked up the ledger again and turned to the first entry. He read it again. This says the first incident was the 21st of May. It does, Clementine said. You were keeping a record from the beginning. From when there was something to record, she said. He looked at her differently then, not with the adjustment that Gideon's look contained, which was always the adjustment of someone recalibrating something they genuinely cared about getting right, but with the adjustment of a man who has just realized that the thing in front of him is not the thing he had a comfortable category for. He had a category for Clementine Caldwell. It was the category that Oakhaven had given her, Walter's daughter, the big one, the seamstress, the woman Finch had publicly rejected. It was not a category that included a woman who kept dated documentary records of criminal approach patterns with the handwriting clarity of a legal clerk. Give me an hour, he said. I'll process the men, and then I'll want your statements. We'll be available, Clementine said. They left the sheriff's office and walked back into the morning light of Oakhaven's main street, and Gideon pulled the wagon to the side of the road, and they sat in it without immediately deciding what to do next, which was its own kind of decision. He's going to do it right, Clementine said. You think so? The ledger changed his arithmetic, she said. He can't back Finch on something documented that thoroughly without putting himself in the record. She looked at the bank building. Jeremiah Finch is going to have a very bad morning. He won't take it quietly, Gideon said. No, she agreed. He won't. She was right on both counts. Tom Alderman processed the three men with the efficiency of a sheriff who has decided which side of a situation he is going to stand on and wants to complete the process before he can be interrupted. He took their statements, took Cutter Mace's statement, which was largely a confirmation of the ledger's contents disguised as a denial, and wrote up the charges with the kind of specific language that told Clementine he had done this properly before and knew what would survive a territorial court's review. What happened at the bank happened while they were in the sheriff's office giving their statements, which meant they heard it secondhand. First from the dry goods man who came in to tell Alderman that there was some kind of commotion at the Finch Bank, then from Dorothy Pruitt, who appeared at the door of the sheriff's office with wide eyes, and the barely suppressed urgency of a woman carrying significant information she has been waiting for a legitimate occasion to deliver. Jeremiah is, Dorothy started. She stopped when she saw Clementine at the desk with the sheriff. The stop had a quality to it. He's at the bank, she said, redirecting. He's arguing with his father. Thank you, Dorothy, Alderman said, in the voice of a man who is not going to act on this information immediately. Dorothy looked at Clementine for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she said unexpectedly, "The riding jacket you made me in February. The stitching at the left cuff." She stopped again. "It's held better than anything I've ever bought. I wanted to say that." Clementine looked at her. Dorothy Pruitt had been in the church in April. She had been in the second pew and she had not laughed, which Clementine had noted, but she also had not said anything, which Clementine had also noted, and the two things had lived together in her accounting of that day as a single incomplete entry. "Thank you," Clementine said. It was the only thing there was to say. Dorothy left. Gideon, beside Clementine, said nothing. She was grateful for that. They finished with Alderman at noon and came out into a main street that had the heightened quality of a place where information is moving faster than people can absorb it. Several people looked at them. Several people looked away. The particular social mathematics of Oakhaven were recalculating themselves in real time, which was something Clementine had known would happen, but had not entirely predicted the texture of. She had expected it to feel like vindication or something adjacent to it. What she actually felt was more complicated and less satisfying. Not the clean arrival of justice, but the uncomfortable recognition that the people in this street were the same people who had been in that church. That the town was not a different place because the arithmetic had changed. That what she was watching was not a community understanding something new, but a community adjusting to a new set of pressures. "Let's get the supplies," she said, "and go home." Gideon looked at her. "Home," he said. He said it with a particular care, the way he said things he wanted to make sure he was hearing correctly. "Whisper Ridge," she said. "That's what I said." "Yes," he said. "It is." They were loading the wagon when Jeremiah Finch came down the main street. He was not accompanied by anyone, which was notable. Jeremiah Finch, with no one around him, had the quality of something operating outside its natural conditions, a fish in the wrong kind of water. He was dressed well, as he always was, and his face had the controlled quality of a man who has had an extremely bad morning and has decided that the way through it is to manage the appearance of having had a merely moderate one. He walked straight toward them. People on the street made small, instinctive adjustments to their position, the physical grammar of a community navigating around a developing situation. Gideon saw him coming first and set down what he was carrying without hurry, and when Jeremiah reached them, he had both hands free and his weight evenly settled, which was not a threatening posture but was a ready one. Jeremiah stopped 6 feet from the wagon. He looked at Gideon and then at Clementine and then at the supplies in the wagon bed with the expression of a man performing an assessment he has already completed. "I'd like to speak with Miss Caldwell," he said. He said it with the reasonable voice, the one he had used in the church, the one that was warm and measured and gave the impression of a man operating from a position of such comfortable authority that even his conflicts were merely administrative matters. "She can hear you from here," Gideon said. Jeremiah's jaw shifted slightly. He transferred his gaze to Clementine with the deliberate quality of a man who has decided to treat an obstacle as if it does not exist. "Clementine," he said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." She looked at him. She let the silence sit for 2 full seconds before she said anything, because she had learned from Gideon that silence was not an absence. It was a territory you either owned or ceded. 3 men on my property with a torch in the night, she said. What part of that is a misunderstanding? Those men were not acting under any instruction of mine, he said. He said it with the smoothness of a prepared statement, which it was. Cutter Mace has worked for your family for 11 years, she said. That's in the ledger. Along with the date of the tracks at the South Crossing and the date your men rode the North Trail and the date they came through the East Ridge. She held his gaze. Sheriff Alderman has the ledger now. The Territorial Court's office in Pueblo will receive a copy by post this week. Something moved in Jeremiah Finch's face, not the composed adjustment she was accustomed to seeing there, but something more immediate, something that preceded composition. He had not known about Pueblo. She watched him calculate the implications of a territorial court record and find the calculation unfavorable. You're making a serious mistake, he said, and the reasonable voice had a new quality to it, something under the surface that was not quite anger, but was in the same category. I've made thorough records, she said. That's different from a mistake. You don't understand what my family's position in this territory. Jeremiah. She said his name the way you say a word when you want it to carry the weight of every other word you've decided not to say. You stood in a church and held my wrist up in front of witnesses so that people could laugh at me. You sent men with a torch to my home in a storm. She kept her voice level, not because she wasn't feeling anything, but because the level voice was the one that carried. I have documentation. You have a reputation that currently includes 3 employees in Tom Alderman's jail and a territorial record that your father is, from what I understand, not pleased about. She picked up the last bundle from the boardwalk and set it in the wagon. I understand your family's position perfectly. You should take some time to understand mine. The street was quiet, not the silence of the church, not the held breath of witnesses waiting for someone powerful to finish performing, but something different. The silence of people who are paying attention to something they didn't expect. Jeremiah Finch stood in that silence for 3 seconds. She counted, not because she was performing composure, but because she found that counting gave her something to do with the part of her mind that was monitoring his hands, his posture, the distance between them. He said nothing further. He turned and walked back toward the bank, and the people on the street made those same small adjustments in reverse. The physical grammar reconfiguring itself as the situation resolved into something that had, apparently, a shape after all. Gideon finished loading the wagon. He climbed to the seat, and she climbed up beside him, and he took the reins and they moved north out of Oak Haven the way they had come, at the unhurried pace of people who have completed what they came to do. Pueblo, he said, after they had cleared the north end of town. I meant it, she said. I'll write the letter this week. He'll know that a territorial record makes him legally exposed, Gideon said, not just locally. The Finch family has interests in Denver and the mining operations east of here. A formal criminal record in the territory affects all of it. I know, she said. That's why I said it in the street and not in the sheriff's office. I wanted him to hear it where people could. He looked at her sidelong again. The almost smile came, and this time it got further than it usually did before he brought it back. Far enough that she saw it plainly, far enough that she thought it might have been a genuine smile if it had been allowed to complete. Measure twice, he said. Exactly, she said. The ride home took longer than the ride in because the high crossing was still running heavy from the storm, and they had to go around to the lower ford, which added an hour to the journey. She didn't mind. The afternoon had the quality that sometimes arrived after things that had been anticipated for a long time finally happened. Not relief exactly, because relief implied the threat was fully resolved, and she was not naive enough to believe that yet, but a loosening of something that had been held at tension. She was aware of him beside her with a different quality of awareness than she had carried for most of the previous months. Something had shifted in the night. Not dramatically, not in the way that stories resolve things dramatically, but in the specific, understated way that real shifts happened, when 2 people have been through something difficult together and come out the other side, and the relationship has a new fact in it that neither of them has yet found the language for. She was not going to be the first to speak to it directly. That was not strategic, it was simply accurate. She was still learning Gideon Hayes, and one of the things she had learned was that he processed things at his own speed, and that the processing was genuine rather than delayed, and that what came out of it was worth waiting for. What she hadn't anticipated was how soon it would come. They were at the lower ford, the horses taking the crossing at a careful angle, the water running cold and clear around the wheels, when he said, I want to talk about the proposition. She waited. The one I made in the church, he said. Wages and a roof and the domestic work. He kept his eyes on the horses and the crossing and the bank ahead. I want to renegotiate it. On what terms? She said. Different ones, he said. He navigated the horses up the far bank and onto the solid ground of the north side, and then, with the crossing behind them and the road ahead clear and the horses settled to their pace again, he said, I wrote my sister that things had changed. I didn't tell her what changed, because I didn't have the right words yet. And now? She said. I'm still not sure I have the right words, he said, but I think I have some. He was looking at the road, but it was the looking at something else of a man who is thinking, not avoiding. When I found you in that yard last night, standing in the rain with the iron bar and 2 men on the ground, the thing I felt... He stopped, started again. It wasn't surprise. That's what I keep coming back to. I wasn't surprised. I was... He chose carefully. I was confirmed. Like something I already knew was true had just shown itself to be exactly true. She didn't say anything. She let him have the space for it. I've been alone for 18 years, he said. Not because I preferred it, because the circumstances were what they were, and I adapted to them. And then you walked out of that church and into this situation, and in 3 months you've... Another stop. You've made the house a place I want to come back to. Not the building, the... He made a small, frustrated gesture with one hand, the gesture of a man who has good thoughts and approximate language. The situation of it, the quality of it. I know what you mean, she said quietly. I'm asking if you'd consider staying, he said. Not on the original terms, on different ones. He paused. As my wife, if that's something you'd consider. The road ran north into the mountains and the horses moved steadily, and above them the afternoon sky had the clean, washed quality that came after storms at elevation, and Clementine Caldwell sat in the wagon next to the scarred mountain man who had walked into a church and paid a debt and offered her a fair situation and had subsequently, over 3 months of days and evenings and one storm, demonstrated that he was exactly what he appeared to be, which was not a comfortable thing to find in a person and was also the most valuable thing there was. She thought about what she wanted to say, and then she said it plainly, because she had been working on taking up her full space, and this seemed like a moment that required it. I'd consider it seriously, she said. I'd need to know you understand what you're asking. Not a housekeeper with a different title, a partner. Equal say in the ranch decisions, in the property, in how we handle things. Yes, he said. And I'd need to keep the record keeping, she said. The ledger, the documentation, that's not negotiable. If Finch isn't finished, and I don't think he is, we need that record. Agreed, he said. And Margaret stays, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The hen. She was here before I renegotiated, and she'll be here after, Clementine said. Those are my terms. This time the almost smile completed. It arrived fully, in the afternoon light on the north road, on the face of a man who had not produced a full smile in longer than she could estimate. And it was not a polished or handsome thing. It was the smile of a person who has been given something they had stopped expecting, which made it the most genuine expression she had ever seen on another adult's face. Margaret stays, he said. She looked at the road ahead of them, at the mountains coming closer with each mile, at the pass that would take them back to Whisper Ridge. Then yes, she said, I'd consider it. That's not a yes, he said. No, she said, it's a serious consideration. Give me a week. Fair enough, he said. She gave him 4 days, not because she needed 4 days to decide, but because she needed 4 days to be certain that what she was deciding was what she wanted, rather than what the circumstances were pressing her toward, and that was an important distinction to her. She had spent 26 years making decisions that were shaped entirely by external pressure, and she was not going to make this one that way. On the 4th day, she came in from the garden at late afternoon and found him at the table with the second letter to his sister. She knew it was a second letter because the paper and the handwriting had the quality of a continuation rather than a beginning. And she stood in the doorway and watched him write for a moment, and then said, "Yes." He put the pen down. He turned in his chair and looked at her with the full, unguarded attention she had been collecting since April. "Yes," he said back. "It's not going to be easy," she said. "Finch isn't finished. The town isn't finished. There'll be complications." "I know," he said. I have no money of my own and no family that functions, she said. I'm bringing a sewing kit and a gray hen with a bad disposition. I know, he said again, and there was something in his voice, not amusement, but the quality adjacent to it, the quality of a man who has examined a situation completely and found it not just acceptable, but genuinely wanted. She came to the table and sat across from him, and the letter to his sister was between them with its incomplete second paragraph. And outside the valley was settling into the long evening light that she had come to think of as Whisper Ridge's particular gift. The way the mountains held the sunset longer than the lowlands, stretching the good light past the time when it would have been gone anywhere else. What did you tell her? Clementine said, indicating the letter. That I was going to marry someone, he said, if she'd agree to it. She looked at him. You wrote that before I answered. I was optimistic, he said. It was the driest, most Gideon thing he had ever said to her, and she laughed. The real laugh, the full one, the kind that startled Margaret when it got out, and this time it startled Gideon too, or produced in him the thing that wasn't quite startled but was its neighbor. And he watched her laugh with the expression of a man who is understanding something about what he has signed up for and finding it, on balance, considerably better than what he'd had before. What neither of them could see from inside that kitchen, inside that long, good light, was the letter that had already been sent from Oakhaven to Pueblo, not by Clementine but by Tom Alderman, forwarding the relevant documentation to the Territorial Court's office, with a cover letter that named Jeremiah Finch specifically. Alderman had done it that same day, the morning after they brought the men in, before Finch had spoken to anyone. That was the detail that would matter most in what came next. Not that Alderman was brave, because Clementine had been right that he was not particularly brave, but that he was practical, and the most practical thing he had seen in years was that ledger, dated and specific and clear, in handwriting that a court would read without apology. The Territorial Court's response came to Oakhaven 11 days after that letter was sent, and what it contained set in motion the sequence of events that Jeremiah Finch had not planned for, because Jeremiah Finch had never once in his life seriously entertained the possibility that a woman he had dismissed in a church in April would spend the following 3 months building a documented record that would prove to be exactly the thing a territorial court needed to act. He had made the mistake that people consistently made about Clementine Caldwell. He had seen her and categorized her and moved on, confident in the category. And the category had been wrong from the beginning. Harlan Finch, Jeremiah's father, the man who had originally held Walter Caldwell's debt, came to the sheriff's office himself when the territorial summons arrived, which told Alderman and told the town something about the seriousness of what the court had found in the documentation. Harlan Finch was 63 and had built his position in Oakhaven over 30 years and was not a man who made personal appearances at the sheriff's office for minor matters. He came with the family's lawyer, a man named Kress, who was based in Pueblo and had ridden hard to get to Oakhaven ahead of the summons's implications. Alderman sent a rider to Whisper Ridge. The rider arrived on a Wednesday morning while Clementine was in the garden and Gideon was splitting wood, and the message he carried was brief. Sheriff requests your presence at your earliest convenience. Territorial matter. Bring the ledger. She brought the ledger. She had brought it to Oakhaven before, but this time she carried it differently. Not as evidence she was presenting for evaluation, but as a record she had created, whose content she knew completely, whose every date and description she could reproduce from memory if asked. It had become hers in the way that the things you build always become yours, regardless of who they're intended for. They came into Oakhaven on Thursday and found it waiting for them, which was not something she could have anticipated specifically, but which she had understood in general. The town reconfigured by information, the balance of its social mathematics shifted in ways that showed in small, visible details. The pulled shade at the Finch bank was up, but the interior window reflected light in a way that told her someone was watching from back in the room. Dorothy Pruitt was on the boardwalk again, and this time did not manage to say anything before Clementine had passed, but the effort was visible, and that was its own information. Alderman's office was fuller than it had been the first time. Kress, the Finch lawyer, had the desk across from Alderman and a stack of papers that he was arranging with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been doing this long enough to know that the arrangement of papers communicates something. Alderman himself had the expression of a man standing on ground that has become more contested than he originally expected and is managing that fact by being extremely precise about procedure. Harlan Finch was there. She had not seen him before. She had known Jeremiah, knew the family by reputation, but Harlan had been background to the story she'd been living. He was older than she'd expected, smaller than his son, with the kind of stillness that came not from nature but from long practice. A man who had spent decades learning to produce calm as a strategic surface over whatever was actually happening underneath. He looked at her when she came in. She looked back. Jeremiah was not there, which was information. "Miss Caldwell," Alderman said. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for coming. Mr. Kress has some questions about the ledger, and then we'll discuss what the territorial court has sent." What followed was 2 hours of the kind of procedural conversation that she had never previously been part of, but that she found, to her own mild surprise, she was well suited for. Kress was good at his work. He was precise and skeptical, and he asked questions that were designed to find inconsistencies in the record, and she answered them with the flatness of someone who knows their record is accurate and has nothing to add to it or subtract from it. He challenged the date of the first entry. She told him what she had observed and when and how she had determined the age of the tracks. He challenged her identification of Cutter Mace, noting she had not personally known him before that night. She told him that Gideon had identified Mace by name and that Mace himself had not denied his identity when questioned by Alderman. He challenged the assertion that the men had intended harm to the property, noting that no fire had been set. She told him that intent was visible in preparation, and that an unlit torch on a property one had accessed without permission, in the dark, in a storm, represented preparation of a specific kind. Harlan Finch watched her answer Kress's questions with an expression that she could not entirely read, which was unusual. She could generally read people, had been doing it her whole life as a survival skill. What she could determine was that he was not performing the confidence his son performed. He was simply present, assessing, and whatever he was assessing was producing something in him that had not been there at the beginning of the conversation. At the end of the 2 hours, Kress gathered his papers and spoke quietly with Harlan for several minutes. Then Harlan turned to Alderman and said, in the voice of a man stating a business decision, "The family will settle the matter." Alderman looked at him. "Settle meaning?" "The charges against Cutter Mace and the other men," Harlan said. "We'll admit to them. Mace will not contest. The other two will follow his lead." He paused. "In exchange for the matter remaining at the local level rather than proceeding at the territorial level." Alderman looked at Clementine. She thought about it for exactly the time it took her to evaluate what she actually wanted. Not what would satisfy a desire for spectacle, not what would produce the most public humiliation of the Finch family, but what would actually make Whisper Ridge safe and what would build the kind of record that made future action difficult. "Mace's admission and the formal record of the charges," she said, "in writing, filed with the territorial court regardless, and a written statement from the Finch family acknowledging that Gideon Hayes' title to Whisper Ridge is uncontested and that no member of the Finch family or their employees will approach the property." Kress made a sound that was not quite an objection. "That's our offer," she said. Harlan Finch looked at her for a long moment. Then he said to Kress, "Draft it." She walked out of Alderman's office into the afternoon light of Oakhaven with a signed document in her hand and Gideon beside her and the ledger under her arm, and the street was doing what the street did, the ordinary commerce of a working frontier town, and she stood on the boardwalk and breathed in the familiar smell of the place, dust and horse and cut lumber and the faint sweetness of whatever the bakery was producing. And she felt the complicated, unresolving thing that she had been working toward all spring. It was not triumph. She had been right that it would not feel like triumph. It was more like the conclusion of a sentence that had been going on for 26 years, the period finally placed at the end of a long and difficult construction, and the sentence now complete and her hands free. "It's not over," Gideon said. He was looking at the bank building. "I know," she said, "but it's different now." "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at the street, at the boardwalk where Margaret Holt had once spoken her name with the specific inflection of someone cataloging a known quantity, at the dry goods store where she had bought thread for 12 years and been paid in goodwill and partial amounts, at the church at the far end of the street, whose doors she had walked through in April and out of into a different life. She was not the same person who had stood on that boardwalk in April. She was not a better version of her. She was not improved or elevated or corrected. She was more fully what she had always been, which was something different and truer than improvement. She turned north, toward the wagon, toward the road home. "Let's go," she said. The document sat in the ledger for 3 days before Clementine moved it. She had placed the signed statement, Harlan Finch's acknowledgement, Cutter Mace's formal admission, the territorial court's filing confirmation, between the last written page of the ledger and the back cover, and she had set the ledger on the shelf where she kept her sewing supplies, between the thread stock and the small glass jar of spare needles. It was not a ceremonial placement. She put it there because she needed to see it every morning when she opened the cabinet. Not as a reminder of victory, but as a reminder of what thorough, patient work could produce in a world that generally expected people like her to simply absorb what was done to them and move on. On the third day, she took it out and moved it to the document box Gideon kept on the high shelf above the fireplace, where he stored the land deed and the water rights paper and the 3 trapping licenses he renewed every year in Pueblo. She put the Finch document in with those papers because that was what it was, a legal instrument, part of the record of Whisper Ridge's standing in the world, and it belonged with the other instruments that said what this land was and who it belonged to. Gideon watched her do this from the table, where he was working through the accounts for the season's trap runs. He said nothing, but she was aware of him being aware of her, which was its own kind of presence. "It's filed," she said. "It doesn't need to live on the working shelf anymore." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She closed the document box and left it on the high shelf and went back to the garden, which needed her. The summer that followed was the most demanding season Whisper Ridge had seen in 3 years, according to Gideon, who tracked seasons the way he tracked everything, in precise comparative terms that resisted sentimentality. The rain came irregularly, too much in June and too little in July, which required her to rethink the watering schedule for the kitchen garden mid-season, which she did with the same methodical attention she had brought to it from the beginning. The bean crop was good despite the conditions, which she took note of without discussing further. The root vegetables came in strong. The chickens, under Margaret's continued presidency, maintained their productivity with the stubborn consistency of animals that had decided they were going to perform their function regardless of what the weather was doing. Gideon's trapping season was his best in 4 years. He said this with the same flat specificity with which he said everything factual, but she had learned to read him well enough to know that the number behind the statement carried real satisfaction, the satisfaction of a man whose work had returned to him what he had put into it. He brought back good pelts in good condition and spent the evenings of those weeks working the leather with the focused quiet of his best moods, and she sat across from him with her sewing or her reading. She had finished the Cooper novel and started the second of his 3 books, which was proving more uneven, but still worth the time. And the stove held them both in its warmth, and the mountain did its work outside, and the evenings were the best part of the days. They were not always easy with each other. She needed to keep saying that to herself, not as a correction to something she was misremembering, but as an accurate accounting of what their life actually was. Gideon was still stubborn about certain things in ways that occasionally required her to choose between pressing a point and letting it rest. And the calculus of that choice was different every time, depending on what the point was and what the cost of the argument would be. He went quiet sometimes for reasons that were entirely internal, not about her, she had learned, but about whatever he was working through, some thought or memory or plan that he was processing in the private way he processed everything. And in the early weeks, she had sometimes interpreted these silences as a response to something she'd done. And the misinterpretation had produced small, unnecessary anxieties that she had eventually managed by simply asking him directly whether the silence was about her or about something else. The first time she asked that, he had looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between surprised and grateful. "Something else," he said. "Always say something if it's about you." "I don't always know that I've done something until I can see it from outside," she told him. "That's an honest limitation." "Same," he said. And that was the end of it, but it also wasn't the end of it, because it became a practice between them. A small, functional one. The kind that only develops between people who are genuinely trying to make a shared space work rather than simply occupying the same square footage. She had her own silences. She was aware of that. She went quiet about her father sometimes, about Walter Caldwell, who was, as far as she knew, still in Oakhaven, still managing his way through whatever came next after losing the farm to the Finchbanks foreclosure at the end of April. She had not seen him since the church. She had received no letter, no message, no word passed through any person in any direction, which was an absence that she had decided to treat as information rather than wound. It told her what she had probably known for a long time about what she had been to Walter, a problem he had tried various ways to solve, and her departure had been, in its own way, the solution he had most needed. She thought about that one evening in July, sitting on the front porch after supper with the valley laid out below her in the last light, and Gideon came out and sat in the other chair, and they were quiet together for a while in the way they had gotten good at. "My father hasn't written," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been deciding how to feel about that." "What have you decided?" She thought about it. "That I spent a long time trying to make myself into something that would solve his problem," she said. "And the thing he actually needed wasn't something I could be. So I should stop measuring his absence as a verdict on my worth and start measuring it as information about his limitations." She paused. "I'm still working on the second part." "That's honest," he said. "It's the only way I know how to be," she said. He put his hand on the arm of her chair, not on her hand, not reaching across, just placing his hand on the wood near hers, which was a Gideon Hayes gesture if ever there was one. Present without pressure, close without demanding anything in return. She looked at his hand on the chair arm and then looked out at the valley and felt the thing she had been building a name for all summer. Not happiness exactly, not in the clean, complete sense of the word, but something more durable than happiness, something that had friction and weight and the specific warmth of things that have been earned rather than given. They were married in August, in the valley, with no ceremony beyond what they themselves produced, which was a short exchange of spoken commitments on the front porch of the house on a Tuesday morning, while the mountain took no notice, and the chickens continued their discussions in the yard below. She wore the best dress she owned, which she had altered from the blue dress she had come to Whisper Ridge in, taking it in at the shoulders and letting it out at the hips, and adding a detail of stitching at the cuffs that was her own pattern, one she had been developing in her head for years and finally executed on a garment that was actually hers. He wore his clean clothes. He had brushed his coat. She said what she meant, and he said what he meant, and they were married, and the valley held the morning light the way it did, and Margaret watched from the coop door with the expression of someone who had seen everything and was reserving judgment. After, they had coffee on the porch, and she laughed at something he said, the real laugh, and he produced the full smile again. It came more easily now, not frequently, but without the mechanical recall that had characterized it in the spring, as if the muscle that produced it was getting practice. And that was the morning of their marriage, and it was exactly sufficient. The letter from his sister arrived 6 weeks later. Ruth Hayes was 36, 3 years younger than Gideon, and lived in Denver with her husband, who worked in the rail industry, and their 2 children. She had been writing to Gideon twice a year with the faithful consistency of a person who refuses to let distance become abandonment, and his letters back had been what they were: infrequent, brief, honest, in the way that his brevity was always honest. The letter she sent in response to his announcement of the marriage was 3 pages long, which was, Clementine understood when she read the first page that he handed to her, the longest letter Ruth had ever written her brother, because it contained 3 pages worth of things she had been waiting for years to have the occasion to say. She had written, among other things, "I have been telling you for 9 years that the right person was not the person who needed you to be without damage. The right person was the one who looked at the damage and decided it was workable. Write and tell me everything." Clementine read that line twice. Then she folded her portion of the letter carefully and handed it back to Gideon. "She sounds like Agnes Bryce," she said. "Who?" "The woman in Oakhaven who told me to take up my full space," she said. "The one who died of the fever." "Ah," he said. He looked at the letter. "Ruth says that too. In different language." He paused. "She wants to visit." "Tell her yes," Clementine said. "You don't want to think about it first?" "I've thought about it," she said. "You need your sister. She should come." He wrote back that day, and she added a paragraph at the end of the letter introducing herself in the direct, undecorated way she introduced herself to everything, and sealed it and sent it with the next supply rider south. Ruth came in October, and she was not what Clementine expected, which was fitting because Clementine had been refusing to expect things since April and had still not entirely broken the habit. She had assembled a picture of Gideon's sister from his brief descriptions and the letter, and the picture had been approximate at best. Ruth Hayes Mercer was small and quick-moving, where her brother was large and deliberate, and she had his eyes, the same flat, accurate quality of attention, but she deployed them in a completely different register, with the full front directness of a woman who had decided long ago that the most efficient path to understanding a situation was to look at it without apology. She got off the wagon at Whisper Ridge and looked at the house and the barn and the garden and the chicken coop, and then she looked at Clementine, and then she hugged her brother in the brief, fierce way of people who have been separated from someone they love for longer than they wanted to be, and then she turned back to Clementine and said, "Show me the garden. I want to see what you built." That was how they started, and it was the right start. Ruth stayed for 10 days, and in those 10 days the shape of Whisper Ridge shifted again in a way that Clementine had not anticipated. It became briefly a place with more voices in it, more movement, the specific energy of a family that is still in the early stages of finding out what it is. Ruth's husband had remained in Denver with the children, who were 7 and 9 and could not be removed from school for the journey, and Ruth had made the trip alone with the efficient determination of a woman who was going to do what she had decided to do and would sort out the logistics. On the third day, in the kitchen after supper when Gideon was in the barn doing the evening check, Ruth said, "He's different." Clementine looked up from the mending she was working on. "Different from what?" "From the last time I saw him." Ruth held her coffee cup in both hands. 3 years ago. I came up then too for a week. He was," she considered, "he was managing, that's the word. He was managing everything well and feeling very little." "And now?" "Now he feels things," Ruth said simply. "I can see it. He's not comfortable with it yet, which is very him, but it's there." She looked at Clementine directly with those accurate eyes. "That's you." "That's him," Clementine said. "I just gave him something to feel things about." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I want to ask you something," she said. "And I want you to know I'm asking because I'm genuinely interested, not because I'm evaluating you." "Go ahead," Clementine said. "Were you frightened?" Ruth asked. "When you left with him, in April?" Clementine thought about it honestly. "Not frightened," she said. "Uncertain. There's a difference. Frightened is when you think the outcome will be bad. Uncertain is when you don't know what the outcome will be." She set down the mending. "I had spent so long in a situation where the outcome was known and it was bad. Uncertainty felt like an improvement." Ruth absorbed this. "That's a remarkable way to think about it." "It's a practical one," Clementine said. "I'm a practical person. I had nothing and I had an offer. The offer was made by someone who paid a debt he didn't owe and then asked me what I wanted. That was more than anyone had done in 26 years. She picked up the mending again. "The rest I could figure out." "And have you?" Ruth asked. "Figured it out?" Clementine looked at the stitching she was working on. His coat again, the right elbow this time, the same coat in a new place, which was its own kind of record of the life they were building. "Most days," she said. "Some days I'm still figuring. That seems right for the size of the undertaking." Ruth smiled. It was Gideon's almost smile completed, the genetic inheritance of the expression his face kept pulling back. "I like you," she said. "Considerably." "I like you too," Clementine said. "Considerably." That was the beginning of a correspondence that would continue for years, the kind of correspondence that builds a relationship at distance, letter by letter, truth by truth, with all the time in the world and no urgency except the genuine desire to know another person. After Ruth left, the valley contracted back to its two-person shape, and Clementine found that she appreciated that shape more clearly for having temporarily held a different one. The quiet was not absence. It was the specific quiet of a place that had established itself, that had its routines and its logic and its requirements, that knew what it was. It was in that post-October quiet that the question of children first presented itself in the shape it would eventually take. They had not spoken directly about it. The fact of Gideon's situation, the illness, the permanent consequence, was something she had been given at the beginning, set out with the same flat honesty with which he handled everything, and she had filed it away as a fact about the landscape of their life together rather than a wound to be navigated around. It was true that she had thought about it. She was a person who thought about things, but she had not brought it to him because she did not yet know, in October, what she wanted to bring. A question, a proposal, an observation, something she had not yet fully articulated to herself. What brought it into focus was a specific day in November. She had gone to Oak Haven with the wagon for the winter supply run. Gideon was managing a problem with the barn's east wall that had developed in the October cold and couldn't be left. And she was coming out of the dry goods store when she saw the child. He was perhaps 9 years old, sitting on the boardwalk outside the saloon with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up, wearing clothes that were not adequate for the November cold in the mountains, and he had the specific stillness of a child who has learned that stillness is safer than movement. She had seen that stillness before. She had worn it herself at a similar age, in a different context, and she recognized it the way you recognize something you've carried in your own body. She stopped. She did not know this child. She knew most of the children in Oakhaven by sight, if not by name. It was that kind of town. But this one she had not seen before, which told her he was not from here, or not from here recently. She sat down beside him on the boardwalk, which was not the standard response to an unknown child outside a saloon, but she was Clementine Caldwell Hayes, and she had stopped managing her instincts according to what was standard in April. "You cold?" she said. He looked at her sidelong with eyes that were old in the way a child's eyes get old when they've spent time in situations that require them to assess adults quickly. "Some," he said. "Where's your coat?" "Don't have one," he said, not with complaint, as a fact. "Where are your people?" He was quiet for a moment, doing the calculation she'd seen him begin with his sideways look, deciding what was safe to tell her and what wasn't. "My uncle's inside," he said, and pointed at the saloon door, and the tone of those 4 words told her everything she needed to know about the quality of the arrangement he was currently living in. She sat with him for a few minutes and asked him simple questions in the way you ask. Simple questions of a child who is not sure whether you're safe. About the weather, about the boardwalk, about whether he'd had anything to eat that day. That last question delivered casually enough that answering it didn't require him to admit to something shameful. He hadn't. She went into the bakery across the street and bought bread, and came back and gave it to him, and he ate it the way a child eats when he's been hungry long enough that he doesn't care anymore who sees. She went back to the dry goods store and she finished her supply list and she loaded the wagon and she thought about that child the entire 4-hour drive home, through the low crossing and the North Pass and the long climb to Whisper Ridge. And when she came in and Gideon was at the table with sawdust in his hair from the barn work, she put down what she was carrying and said, "I want to talk about something." He looked at her. Whatever was in her face told him it was not a small something because he put down what he was holding and gave her his full attention. She told him about the child. She told him accurately and without embellishment, the way she kept the ledger, because embellishment would have suggested she was trying to build a case rather than describe a situation. When she was done, Gideon was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm still figuring out what I want to propose." She looked at her hands. "But I've been thinking, since before this, since August, if I'm honest, about what we build here, what this place is." She looked up at him. "You built this property for one person. I've been adjusting it to be for 2, and I keep—" She stopped, found the words. "I keep thinking about what it could hold." He was looking at her with the full, unguarded attention he'd shown her in the rain after the storm. "You're talking about children," he said. "I'm talking about children who don't have what they need," she said, "which is not the same thing, but it leads to the same place." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to pretend that the situation is something it isn't. I know what the illness did. I know what that cost you. I'm not trying to replace it or resolve it or make it not matter." She was careful here because it was important to be careful. "I'm saying that there are other ways to have children, and some of those ways involve children who are already here and already need what we could give them." He was quiet for a long time. Not the processing quiet, something deeper, something that had the quality of a person going to a place in themselves that they don't visit casually and examining what's there. "I've thought about it," he said finally. "On my own. I haven't said anything because I didn't know how to raise it without it sounding like I was resolving something I should be grieving instead." "Both can be true," she said. "You can grieve the thing that didn't happen and still want the thing that could." He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since before I could see the shape of it clearly," she said. "Yes." "The boy on the boardwalk," he said. "He's not the only one," she said. "He's the one I saw today. There are others. In Oakhaven, in Pueblo, in the places people get shed of children they don't want or can't keep." She said it plainly because it was a plain truth. I know what it is to be a person nobody can find a category for. I know what it costs in the long run. And I know we have space here and winter stores, and I can sew and you can build, and between us we have most of what a child actually needs. Most, he said. Most is what's available, she said. Perfect isn't a category that exists. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He said, I need a few days. Take them, she said. He took 4. She did not press him because she had given herself 4 days in June, and she understood what 4 days meant from a man like Gideon Hayes. It meant the decision was being made at the level where it needed to be made, without shortcuts. On the 4th day, he came in from the barn and sat down and said, Yes. Yes, she said back, and that was the whole of the conversation, because between two people who had gotten good at plain speech, it was enough. The boy from the boardwalk was named Ellis. She found this out in December when she went back to Oakhaven with a deliberate intention rather than a supply list, or rather in addition to the supply list. Tom Alderman was the first person she spoke to, because Alderman knew the town's arrangements in the practical, unromantic way that sheriffs know the arrangements of small towns, and she needed practical and unromantic information. Ellis was 9. His mother had died of a fever in September. His father had not been present since Ellis was 3, and his whereabouts were unknown. The uncle, a man named Garrett, who drank with focused dedication and worked when he absolutely could not avoid it, had taken the boy because there had been no one else, and the quality of the arrangement was what it was. What would it take? Clementine said to Alderman. He looked at her across his desk with the expression of a man who has been surprised by this woman before and has not entirely caught up. Take for what? To make it legal, she said. For us to take the boy. Alderman was quiet for a moment. Garrett would have to agree, he said. He's the current guardian, and you'd need to file with the territorial court in Pueblo. Would Garrett agree? Alderman's expression said what he couldn't say in official language. He hasn't been sober for 3 consecutive days since September, he said. I think if the right arrangement were presented clearly, he'd agree. What's the right arrangement? Something that removes a responsibility he doesn't want, Alderman said, without requiring him to say that out loud. I can manage that, she said. She managed it in one conversation, the following week, in Alderman's office, with Garrett present and smelling of the morning's work, and looking at her across the desk with the bloodshot wariness of a man who is trying to determine what he is being asked to give up. She did not shame him. She did not frame it as rescue or charity or an indictment of his ability to care for the child. She said plainly that she and her husband had a working ranch at Whisper Ridge, and that they were in a position to provide a stable home for Ellis, and that she understood this was a significant decision and that she wanted his time to consider it properly. Garrett considered it for approximately 40 seconds. Then he said, the boy'd be better off, and looked at his hands, and that was as close as he was going to get to saying what was true, and she took it as what it was and thanked him for it, and Alderman drafted the paperwork and she signed it and sent the copy to Pueblo. She went back to the ranch and told Gideon what had happened, and he listened with the full attention he gave things that mattered, and when she was done he said, When does he come? After the territorial court confirms, she said. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Ellis came to Whisper Ridge on a Thursday in January, on the wagon seat beside Clementine, wearing a coat she had made him the week before from good wool she'd ordered specifically for the purpose. I was small for 9, with a careful, watchful quality that she recognized and did not comment on. And he looked at the valley when the wagon came around the last curve with the wide, recalibrating expression of a child who has assembled a picture of a place from description and is now comparing it to the reality. It's bigger than I thought, he said. She had said the same thing, in April, coming the other way. It is, she said. Gideon was in the yard when they arrived. He had spent the previous 3 weeks building a cot into the alcove off the main room, a real cot with a proper frame, and had done it with the same care he brought to anything structural. He stood in the yard when the wagon came in with the unhurried stillness of a large man, making himself as unthreatening as possible, which Ellis noticed and assessed with those old, quick eyes. Gideon crouched down when Ellis got off the wagon, which put him at eye level, which was also noticed. I'm Gideon, he said. This is your home if you want it to be. Ellis looked at him for 3 seconds. What do I have to do? He said. For today? Nothing, Gideon said. There'll be work later. For today, just look around. Ellis looked around. He found the chickens, which produced in him the first expression she had seen that wasn't watchful. Something closer to delight, quickly managed, but real. Margaret came to the coop door and fixed him with her presidential stare, and he stared back, and they appeared to reach some kind of accord that she was not privy to. "That one's Margaret," Clementine said from behind him. "She's big," he said. "Don't let her tell you that's not your problem," Clementine said. "It becomes your problem fast." Ellis looked at her. Then, barely, he smiled. It was not immediate, the ease between them. She had not expected it to be. Ellis had the specific wariness of a child who has been passed from situation to situation and has learned that the promising beginnings of situations were not reliable predictors of how those situations actually developed. He watched. He was quiet. He did his part of the daily work when shown how, and then did it reliably without being reminded, which told her that reliability had been a survival strategy for him. If you did what you were supposed to do, people were less likely to be angry at you. She let him do the work without praise because she understood that excessive praise was its own kind of pressure, was a signal that you were being evaluated, and that what he needed more than praise was the steady, undramatic fact of being included. She showed him how to collect the eggs with a matter-of-factness that treated him as someone competent of learning a thing, which he was. And when he cracked the first one against the side of the basket by accident and looked up at her with the braced expression of someone waiting for the response, she said, "That one's for the frying pan tonight, then," and moved on, and the bracing left him by degrees over the following minutes. Gideon showed him the barn and the horses with the same matter-of-fact inclusion, and at some point in the second week she noticed that Ellis had started following Gideon around in the morning with the instinctive gravity of a small object orbiting a large one, not because he had decided to attach himself, but because Gideon's movements had a purposeful quality that created a natural path, and walking in that path felt like being somewhere. She saw this and she did not say anything about it to Gideon, but he saw it too. She could tell by the adjustments he made without drawing attention to them, the way he began to narrate what he was doing when Ellis was nearby, not teaching exactly but explaining, the difference being that teaching implies a student who needs correction and explaining implies another person who might be interested. "Why does the left horse always go in first?" Ellis asked one morning in the barn. "Because she gets anxious otherwise," Gideon said. "She's been like that since I got her. Some creatures have an order they need, and she needs left first." Ellis absorbed this. "Does she know the difference, left and right?" "She knows the difference between first and not first," Gideon said. "Whether she knows the names for them is her business." Ellis looked at the horse with the concentrated, earnest attention of a child working through a genuine philosophical problem. "I think she knows," he said. "You might be right," Gideon said. That conversation was the first one she overheard between them that had the quality of two people genuinely thinking about something together, rather than one person instructing and one person receiving, and she stood outside the barn door for a moment with the morning cold and the sound of the horses and the two voices inside and felt the thing she had been trying to name for months settle finally into a shape she could hold. It was not happiness in the way people described happiness, not the clean, uncomplicated arrival of something good. It was something with more texture than that, something that had been built from imperfect materials by imperfect people in imperfect conditions, something that had friction and weight and the specific warmth of things that have been worked for. It was a life. Specifically, particularly, difficultly, a life. The years moved through Whisper Ridge the way years move through a working ranch, not in the dramatic installments of stories, but in the accumulation of seasons, each one leaving something behind and taking something away, the accounting never perfectly balanced, but the sum, over time, tending toward what you had built rather than what you had lost. Ellis grew. This was the most ordinary fact, and also the one she returned to most often in the private accounting she kept of their life. The simple biological insistence of a child who had been given adequate conditions and proceeded to use them. By 12, he was doing real work on the property, not the gentle inclusion of a new arrival, but the skilled labor of someone who had spent 3 years learning a place and had learned it well. He had Gideon's accuracy with his hands and something else that was entirely his own, a patience with living things, with the horses and the chickens and the garden, a quality of attention that was empathetic in a way that neither of his parents were by nature. He called them by their names for 2 years and then switched, gradually, without discussion, to the other thing, and neither she nor Gideon made a ceremony of it because making a ceremony of it would have been a different kind of pressure, and both of them by now understood that the things that were true didn't need ceremony to stay true. Ruth visited every other year and wrote in the alternating years, and Clementine's correspondence with her had become one of the genuine satisfactions of her life. Letters that were honest and funny and specific, that treated the distance between Denver and Whisper Ridge as a negotiable inconvenience rather than a permanent fact. Ruth's children came once, in the summer that Ellis was 11, and the three of them spent a week doing the things children do when they are given a working ranch and enough summer daylight. And Clementine watched from the porch and thought about things she did not try to put into full sentences. Jeremiah Finch left Oakhaven in the winter following the signed settlement. She learned this from Alderman, indirectly, through the supply rider who brought news along with goods. Jeremiah had gone to Denver, then east, which was the direction men went when they needed the weight of what they'd done to become smaller in the rearview distance. His father Harlan continued to run the bank until he was 71, and then sold it to a man from Pueblo and retired to a house on the east edge of town where he lived quietly. Clementine did not think about Jeremiah often. When she did, she thought about him without the heat that his name had carried in the early months. Not with forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness implied a debt she was settling, and she did not believe he was owed the work of her forgiveness, but with the flat, factual quality of someone who has put a thing in its proper category and moved on to other things. The category was a man who had looked at her and been wrong. There were worse things to be, and she had lived with the consequences of them, and the consequences had led her here, which was complicated enough that she had stopped trying to resolve it into a clean moral. What she had arrived at, over years, was something simpler and more honest than a moral. It was a picture of what people were actually capable of, which was both less and more than what they were supposed to be. People were capable of looking at someone and deciding she was nothing and being wrong about it for the rest of their lives. They were also capable of walking through a church door in the exact right moment and asking a plain question and meaning it. They were capable of keeping letters across years and building correspondence into genuine knowledge of another person. They were capable of sitting on a boardwalk in November beside a cold child and deciding that was something they were going to do something about. None of those people, not Jeremiah, not Gideon, not Ruth, not even herself, had been consistent about it. Nobody was. The church moment had not made Gideon consistently brave or consistently wise. He was still stubborn about the woodstack and still went quiet in ways that required navigation, and still, 9 years after they married, had moments of the managed stillness that was his oldest way of protecting himself. She was still occasionally too certain too quickly and still had to remember to ask for help when she needed it, instead of carrying things alone until they were too heavy, which was her oldest way of protecting herself. The difference was that they knew these things about each other, named them when necessary, and had made the practical decision to keep going regardless. That was what she thought about most when she thought about what their life actually was. Not the crisis in the church in April, or the storm in June, or the boardwalk in November, though those things had shaped it. What she thought about was the 10,000 smaller moments. The boots were sold and the barn built, and the beans in the correct spot, and the coffee with no milk, and the letters written in the evening, and the full smile that had been slow in coming and was worth it. All of it, in the way that slow things are worth it. Ellis brought the first extra child to the house in the spring he was 14, which was not precisely how they had planned to expand. They had talked about it again, that winter, about the possibility of taking in another child as their situation had settled and their capacity had grown. But Ellis's method was consistent with his character, which was to identify a problem and address it with the direct practicality of someone who had learned that problems did not resolve themselves. The child was 7, a girl named Clara, found in a situation that Ellis described to them that evening with the spare accuracy of someone who had been raised in a house where accuracy was valued. She was the daughter of a woman who had died on the road south of Oakhaven, found by the stage driver, taken to the sheriff, and sitting in Alderman's office in the specific stillness that Clementine recognized across the room before Ellis had finished describing it. She looked at Gideon. He looked at her. "I'll talk to Alderman in the morning," she said. Clara came to Whisper Ridge 3 days later and stood in the yard with the same wide, recalibrating look that Ellis had had at 9. And Ellis showed her the chickens with the patience of someone who remembered being shown the chickens himself, and Margaret fixed the new child with her presidential stare, and the new child stared back, and Clementine, watching from the porch, felt the deep structural satisfaction of something built to hold more than it started with proving that it could. That was the shape the years took. Not dramatic, not managed, not the clean expansion of people who had decided to be heroes. 2 more children came to Whisper Ridge over the following years. A boy of 11 whose parents had both died of fever in the mining camps east of Pueblo, and a girl of 5 whose situation Alderman sent word about because by then he knew that Whisper Ridge was a place you sent word about certain situations to. They came in stages, when the ranch could absorb them, when the timing was right, when the conditions were what they needed to be. Not all of it went well. The 11-year-old, whose name was Thomas, took 2 years to trust anyone, and one of those years was genuinely hard in ways that required patience she had to go looking for when it ran low. The 5-year-old adjusted with the resilience of the very young and made friends with the garden by April. Clementine kept the ledger. Not the same one. She had filled 3 of them by the time the children were all grown. But the practice, the habit of recording what happened accurately and in sequence, because she had learned that the record was never only about what had already happened. It was also about knowing where you were. A person who kept records knew where they had been and how far they had come and what the distance meant, and that knowledge was not nothing. It was in fact the most practical thing she had done in her life, and she had done a great deal of practical things. The sewing continued. It would always continue. It was too much a part of her thinking to stop, and it turned out that a household with 4 children generated a reliable demand for the skill. She made their clothes, and she taught Clara to sew at 9, which Clara took to with a focused, joyful intensity that was entirely her own, and she continued to do the occasional commission for people in Oakhaven who sent word up through the supply riders, because her work was what her work had always been, and the passage of years had not changed that, only accumulated it. Margaret died at an advanced age for a hen, surrounded by her constituency, having never conceded authority for a single day of her life. Clementine buried her at the edge of the garden, where the beans grew, and said nothing formal over the grave, because Margaret had not been a formal creature and would have considered it an imposition. She told Gideon that evening, and he was quiet for a moment, and then said, "She was a good hen," which was the most honest and complete thing that could have been said, and they left it at that. What she understood, that she had not understood at 26 standing in a church with her wrist in a man's hand, was that being seen correctly was not something that arrived all at once or from a single source. It was not a church door opening or a debt paid or a document signed or a smile that had taken months to complete itself. It was all of those things in sequence and none of them alone, and it required a particular kind of person to be in the situation. Not a saved person, not a rescued person, but a person who was already whole and simply needed the conditions where that wholeness had room to show itself. She had been whole in Oakhaven. She had been whole in the church. She had been whole on the boardwalk when Jeremiah Finch held her wrist up for the crowd to assess. The wholeness was not produced by Whisper Ridge or by Gideon Hayes or by anything that came after. It was there before, waiting in the hands that had made 10,000 perfect stitches and the mind that tracked angles and the stubbornness that had kept a low-grade fire going through years of a life that offered very little fuel. What changed was that she was finally in a place where the wholeness had somewhere to go. That, she thought, was what people misunderstood about the stories they told about women like her. The large ones, the plain ones, the ones nobody wanted, the ones who ended up in a church being displayed like livestock. They thought the story was about what someone had done to the woman, and then about what someone had done for the woman, and then about the woman recovering into something better. But the story had never been about what was done to her or for her. The story was about what she had always been, patient in the long dark of a life that hadn't yet given her the right conditions, waiting with the specific, undefeated stubbornness of a person who has not yet found her place but has not been convinced she doesn't have one. She was sitting on the porch of Whisper Ridge in the late afternoon of a September, 9 years married, with the 4 children somewhere on the property doing the things they did, and Gideon somewhere in the barn doing the same, and the mountain above her was doing its evening work with the light, stretching the good gold across the valley floor in the way that she would never entirely get used to, no matter how many evenings she saw it. And she was thinking about none of this explicitly. She was thinking about the dress she was making for Clara, the particular problem of the collar, which wanted to pull left and she hadn't yet resolved why. Gideon came out of the barn and crossed the yard and came up the porch steps and sat in the other chair with the ease of a man who has been performing this sequence for 9 years and has not grown tired of it. He had sawdust in his hair again. He probably always would. "Collar's still pulling," she said. He said. "I think it's the cut at the shoulder," she said. "I need to look at it again in the morning." "You'll figure it out," he said, not as a compliment, as a statement of established fact. She looked at him and he looked at the valley, and the light moved through its stages, and the mountain held them both in the particular unhurried intimacy of terrain that has no agenda, and the children's voices came from somewhere on the property. Laughter, an argument that was resolving itself. Ellis's voice saying something to Thomas in the measured tone of an older brother who has decided to be patient. And the evening smelled of the garden's last growth, and the barn and the mountain cold coming down from the ridge, and the wood smoke from the chimney she hadn't lit yet but would when the temperature dropped another 2 degrees. She went back to thinking about the collar. He went back to looking at the valley. Somewhere in the yard, Margaret's heir, a gray hen that Ellis had named Margaret. 2, with the literal-minded pragmatism of a 14-year-old, was conducting her own administration with the same iron confidence of her predecessor. It was not a perfect life. It never had been, and she had never needed it to be. It was a life made of what 2 broken people had discovered they could build when they stopped waiting for the world to give them better materials and started working with what they had, which was more than either of them had known, more than anyone looking at them from the outside would have estimated, more than a man in a church had weighed her worth against and found insufficient. It was, in the most precise and honest use of the word, enough. And enough, she had learned, was not the consolation prize. Enough was the whole point.